A thick mist rolling across a quiet town doesn't seem frightening at first until it begins to hide things that should not exist. This is The Mist by Stephen King, a chilling tale, born from an idea that struck him after a powerful storm in Maine, when an ordinary supermarket suddenly became the perfect setting for an extraordinary nightmare. First published in 1980, the story has captivated readers around the world for decades, becoming one of King's most memorable works. By then, the creator of Carrie, The Shining, and Salem's Lot had already mastered the art of fear, and The Mist would later inspire the acclaimed 2007 film and a 2017 television adaptation. The visuals in this video are created using today's technology. They may not always perfectly match every scene from the story, but they are designed to help you visualize the world and atmosphere as you listen. What you're about to experience is a third-person retelling, not a word-for-word reading. As you follow the mist alongside its trapped survivors, you'll also discover fascinating facts, adaptation trivia, and behind-the-scenes details along the way. The story begins. The night of July 19th brought the end of the worst heat wave anyone in northern New England could remember. David Drayton watched the first of the vicious thunderstorms roll across Long Lake toward their home just before darkness fell, the air having been deathly still for the preceding hour, so still that the old flag his father had raised on the boathouse in 1936 hung utterly limp against its pole, not even its hem stirring. The heat pressed in like something solid and deep, as sullen as the water in a quarry, and when the three of them had gone swimming that afternoon, it offered no relief unless one ventured far out from shore, which David and his wife Steffi couldn't do, because their 5-year-old son Billy couldn't. They ate a cold supper on the deck facing the lake at 5:30, picking listlessly at ham sandwiches and potato salad, none of them wanting anything except the Pepsi chilling in a steel bucket of ice cubes. Billy went out back to play on his monkey bars afterward, while David and Steph sat in silence, smoking, gazing across the lake's flat mirror to Harrison on the far side, where powerboats droned back and forth, and the evergreens looked dusty and beaten. In the west, massive purple thunderheads were building up like an army massing for attack, lightning flashing within them, and every time the lightning struck, Brent Norton's radio next door, tuned to the classical station broadcasting from Mount Washington, sent out a loud burst of static. Norton, a New Jersey lawyer whose Long Lake property was only a summer cottage lacking furnace and insulation, had been involved in a boundary dispute with David 2 years earlier that had ended up in county court, with David winning, and Norton had sourly attributed the outcome to David being a local. There was no love lost between them. Steph sighed and fanned the top of her breasts with the edge of her halter, and while David doubted it cooled her much, he had to admit it improved the view considerably. He told her he thought a bad storm was coming, though he didn't want to alarm her, and she looked doubtful, pointing out that thunderheads had gathered the previous nights only to break up. He insisted tonight would be different, and when she pressed him on how bad it could get, he recalled how his father had been the first to build a year-round home on that side of the lake, how his father and uncles had put up a summer place there when they were young, only to have a summer storm in 1938, knock it flat, stone walls and everything, leaving only the boathouse standing. His father had started the big house a year later, and David knew it was the trees that did the damage in a bad blow. They got old, and the wind knocked them over, nature's periodic way of cleaning house. He admitted he didn't really know how bad it could get, having only heard stories about the great storm of '38, but he warned the wind could come off the lake like an express train. Billy came back complaining. The monkey bars were no fun because he was all sweated up, and David ruffled his hair and gave him another Pepsi, thinking wryly about more work for the dentist. The thunderheads were pushing closer now, shoving away the blue, and there was no longer any doubt that a storm was coming. Norton had turned off his radio. Billy sat between his parents, fascinated, watching the sky as thunder boomed and rolled slowly across the lake, echoing back again, while the clouds twisted and rolled through shades of black and purple, gradually overspreading the lake with a delicate call of rain extending down from them, still some distance away, probably raining on Bolster's Mills, or maybe even Norway. The air began to move, jerky at first, lifting the flag and then dropping it, but soon it freshened and grew steady, first cooling the perspiration on their bodies and then seeming to freeze it. That was when David saw the silver veil rolling across the lake, blotting out Harrison in seconds and coming straight at them, the powerboats having already vacated. Billy stood up from his miniature director's chair, excited and asking what it was, and David told him it was a water cyclone, urging them inside. Steph threw a quick startled glance at his face and then told Billy to do what his father said. They went in through the sliding glass doors, and David paused after sliding the door shut to look out again. The silver veil was now 3/4 of the way across the lake, having resolved into a crazily spinning teacup between the lowering black sky and the surface of the water, which had gone lead-colored, streaked with white chrome, the lake beginning to look eerily like the ocean with high waves rolling in and sending spume up from the docks and breakwaters, whitecaps tossing their heads back and forth out in the middle. The water cyclone was hypnotic, nearly on top of them, when lightning flashed so brightly it printed everything on David's eyes in negative for 30 seconds afterward, and the telephone gave a startled ting. He turned to see his wife and son standing directly in front of the big picture window that gave a panoramic view of the lake to the northwest, and a terrible vision came to him, one he thought reserved exclusively for husbands and fathers, of the picture window blowing in with a low, hard coughing sound, sending jagged arrows of glass into his wife's bare stomach and his boy's face and neck. The horrors of the Inquisition, he felt, were nothing compared to the fates one's mind could imagine for loved ones. He grabbed them both hard and jerked them away, demanding what they were doing and telling them to get away from there. Steph gave him a startled glance, while Billy only looked at him as if half awakened from a deep dream. He led them into the kitchen and hit the light switch, the phone ting-a-linging again, and then the wind came. It was as if the house had taken off like a 747, a high, breathless whistling that sometimes deepened to a bass roar before soaring up to a whooping scream. He shouted for Steph to go downstairs, having to yell to make himself heard as thunder whacked mammoth planks together directly over the house, making Billy shrink against his leg. Steph yelled back for him to come too, and he nodded, making shooing gestures as he pried Billy off his leg, telling him to go with his mother while he got candles in case the lights went off. He started opening cabinets, thinking how candles were funny things you laid them by every spring, knowing a summer storm might knock out the power. And when the time came, they hid. He pawed through the 4th cabinet, past the half-ounce of grass he and Steph had bought 4 years ago, and still not smoked much of, past Billy's wind-up set of chattering teeth from the Auburn novelty shop, past drifts of photos Steph kept forgetting to glue in their album, looking under a Sears catalog and behind a Kewpie doll from Taiwan that he had won at the Freiburg Fair, knocking over wooden milk bottles with tennis balls. He found the candles behind the Kewpie doll with its glazed dead man's eyes, still wrapped in cellophane, and as his hand closed around them the lights went out, leaving only the electricity in the sky, the dining room lit in a series of white and purple shutter flashes. Downstairs he heard Billy start to cry, and the low murmur of Steph soothing him, but he had to have one more look at the storm. The water cyclone had either passed them or broken up when it reached the shoreline, but he still couldn't see 20 yards out onto the lake, the water in complete turmoil, and he saw someone's dock the jassers, maybe hurry by with its main supports alternately turned up to the sky and buried in the churning water. He went downstairs, and Billy ran to him and clung to his legs. He lifted him up and gave him a hug, then lit the candles. They sat in the guest room down the hall from his little studio, looking at each other's faces in the flickering yellow glow, listening to the storm roar and bash at the house. And about 20 minutes later, they heard a ripping, rending crash as one of the big pines went down nearby, followed by a lull. Steph asked if it was over, and David replied that maybe it was, maybe only for a while. They went upstairs, each carrying a candle like monks going to vespers. Billy, carrying his proudly and carefully carrying the fire, was a very big deal for him, helping him forget about being afraid. It was too dark to see what damage had been done around the house, and though it was past Billy's bedtime, Neither of them suggested putting him in. Terry sat in the living room, listening to the wind and looking at the lightning. About an hour later, it began to crank up again, and David reflected on the queer weather. For 3 weeks the temperature had been over 90, with 6 days of over 100 degrees reported at the Portland jetport, coupled with the grueling winter and late spring, prompting some people to drag out the old chestnut about the long-range results of the 50s of bomb tests, and of course the end of the world, the oldest chestnut of them all. The second squall wasn't so hard, but they heard the crash of several trees weakened by the first onslaught, and as the wind began to die down again, one thudded heavily on the roof, like a fist dropped on a coffin lid, making Billy jump and look apprehensively upward. David reassured him that it would hold, and Billy smiled nervously. Around 10 o'clock the last squall came, bad and howling almost as loudly as the first, lightning seeming to flash all around them, more trees falling, and a splintering crash down by the water that made Steph utter a low cry. Billy had gone to sleep on her lap. David asked what that was, and Steph said she thought it was the boathouse, her voice trembling as she said, "Oh, Jesus!" He told her they were going downstairs again, taking Billy in his arms and standing up, and Steph's eyes were big and frightened as she asked if they were going to be all right. David assured her they would be, and she pressed him for real confirmation, which he gave with the same firm certainty. They went downstairs, and 10 minutes later, as the final squall reached its peak, a splintering crash came from upstairs, the picture window, validating David's earlier terrifying vision. Steph, who had been dozing, woke with a small shriek, and Billy stirred uneasily in the guest bed. She worried aloud about the rain coming in and ruining the furniture, and David tried to reassure her by saying it was insured, but she countered with an upset, scolding tone that insurance didn't make it any better, ticking off the losses: his mother's dresser, their new sofa, the color TV. He hushed her and told her to go to sleep, and though she insisted she couldn't, she was out within 5 minutes. He stayed awake for another half-hour with one lit candle, listening to the thunderwalk and talk outside, feeling certain that there would be many lakefront residents calling their insurance agents in the morning, many chainsaws buzzing as cottage owners cut up fallen trees, and many orange CMP trucks on the roads. The storm was fading with no sign of another squall, so he went back upstairs, leaving Steph and Billy on the bed, and looked into the living room. The sliding glass door had held, but where the picture window had been there was now a jagged hole stuffed with birch leaves, the top of the old tree that had stood by the outside basement access for as long as he could remember. Looking at its top now, visiting in the living room, he understood what Steph had meant about insurance not making it any better. He had loved that tree, a hard campaigner of many winters, the one tree on the lakeside exempt from his own chainsaw. Big chunks of glass on the rug reflected his candle flame repeatedly, and he reminded himself to warn Steph and Billy to wear their slippers in here, since both liked to go barefoot in the morning. He went downstairs again, and all three of them slept together in the guest bed, Billy between Steph and him. He dreamed he saw God walking across Harrison on the far side of the lake, a God so gigantic that above the waist he was lost in a clear blue sky. In the dream he could hear the rending crack and splinter of breaking trees as God stamped the woods into the shape of his footsteps, circling the lake toward the Bridgeton side, toward them, and all the houses and cottages and summer places burst into purple-white flame like lightning, and soon the smoke covered everything like a mist. The next morning, Billy exclaimed in wonder at something, standing by the fence that separated their property from Norton's and looking down the quarter-mile driveway to the camp road that led to Kansas Road. David saw what Billy was looking at, and his heart went cold, warning his son not to go any closer. The morning was bright and clear, the sky having regained a deep, crisp blue that was nearly autumnal, with a light breeze making cheerful sun dapples move across the driveway. Not far from Billy, there was a steady hissing noise, and in the grass lay what might have been mistaken for a writhing bundle of snakes. The power lines leading to their house had fallen in an untidy tangle about 20 feet away, lying in a burned patch of grass, twisting lazily and spitting. If the trees and grass hadn't been so completely damped down by the torrential rains, the house might have gone up, but as it was, there was only that black patch where the wires had touched directly. Billy asked if that could electrocute a person, and David confirmed it could, adding that they would just have to wait for the CMP. When Billy pressed for when they would come, David admitted he didn't know, imagining they were pretty busy that morning, and asked if Billy wanted to walk up to the end of the driveway with him. Billy started to come, but then stopped, eyeing the wires nervously as one humped up and turned over lazily as if beckoning, and asked if electricity could shoot through the ground. David explained that electricity wanted the ground, not him, and he'd be all right if he stayed away from the wires. Billy muttered the phrase to himself, and then came to him, and they walked up the driveway holding hands. It was worse than David had imagined. Trees had fallen across the drive in 4 different places, 1 small, 2 middling, and 1 old giant that must have been 5 feet through the middle, moss crusted onto it like a moldy corset. Branches, some half stripped of their leaves, lay everywhere in jackstraw profusion. They walked up to the camp road, tossing smaller branches off into the woods on either side, and it reminded David of a summer's day maybe 25 years before, when he couldn't have been much older than Billy was now, with all his uncles there spending the day in the woods with axes and hatchets and Darcy poles cutting brush, later sitting down to the trestle picnic table for a monster meal of hot dogs and hamburgers and potato salad, with Gansett beer flowing like water, and his uncle Reuben taking a dive into the lake with all his clothes on, even his deck shoes, back when there were still deer in these woods. Billy asked if he could go down to the lake, and David agreed, since he was tired of throwing branches. They walked back to the house together. Then Billy cut right, going around the house and giving the downed wires a large berth, while David went left into the garage to get his McCullough chainsaw, already hearing the unpleasant song of chainsaws up and down the lake. He topped up the tank, took off his shirt, and was starting back up the driveway when Steph came out, eyeing the downed trees nervously and asking how bad it was. He said he could cut it up, and she reported that she'd gotten the glass cleaned up, but he'd have to do something about the tree in the living room. They couldn't have a tree in there, he agreed. They looked at each other in the morning sunlight and got giggling. He set the McCullough down on the cement areaway and kissed her, holding her buttocks firmly, and she murmured not to, but Billy came tearing around the corner of the house just then, excited about something. Steph saw the live wires and screamed for him to watch out, but Billy was a good distance away and pulled up short, staring at his mother as if she had gone mad, assuring her in the careful tone used to placate the very old and senile that he was okay, walking toward them to prove it, and Steph began to tremble in David's arms. He whispered in her ear that it was all right. Billy knew about the wires, but she argued that people got killed, citing television ads about live wires, and then demanded Billy come inside right now. Billy protested, wanting to show his dad the boathouse, nearly bug-eyed with excitement and disappointment, having gotten a taste of post-storm apocalypse he wanted to share. And when Steph insisted the wires were dangerous, Billy countered that his dad said they wanted the ground, not him. She told him not to argue, but David interjected that he'd come down and look, letting Billy go on down himself, feeling Steph tense against him as he told Billy to go around the other side. Billy tore past them, taking the stone steps 2 by 2, disappearing with his shirt tail flying and trailing back one word of wonder as he spotted some other piece of destruction. David took Steph gently by the shoulders, telling her Billy knew about the wires and was scared of them, which was good. It made him safe. One tear tracked down her cheek as she confessed she was scared, and he tried to brush it off, saying it was over, but she questioned whether it really was, bringing up the hard winter and late spring, the black spring they'd called it in town, saying there hadn't been one in these parts since 1888. The they undoubtedly meant Mrs. Carmody, who kept the Bridge and Antiquary, a junk shop Steph liked to rummage through, and Billy loved to visit, with its shadowy, dusty back rooms filled with stuffed owls with gold-ringed eyes spreading their wings forever, stuffed raccoons standing in a trio around a stream that was a long fragment of dusty mirror, and one moth-eaten wolf foaming sawdust instead of saliva around his muzzle in a creepy eternal snarl. Mrs. Carmody claimed the wolf was shot by her father as it came to drink from Stevens Brook one September afternoon in 1901. David reflected on how the expeditions to Mrs. Carmody's antiquary suited both his wife and son. Steph was into carnival glass, while Billy was fascinated by death in the name of taxidermy. But he felt the old woman held an unpleasant influence over Steph's mind, which was otherwise practical, and hard-headed Mrs. Carmody had found Steph's vulnerable spot, a mental Achilles heel, and Steph wasn't the only one in town fascinated by the woman's Gothic pronouncements and folk remedies, always prescribed in God's name. He mentally ticked off examples: stump water for bruises, if your husband got too free with his fists after 3 drinks, counting rings on June caterpillars, or measuring August honeycomb to predict winter, and the storied Black Spring of 1888. He heard that story himself. They liked to pass it around up here, how if the spring was cold enough the ice on the lakes would turn as black as a rotted tooth, rare but hardly a once-in-a-century occurrence, though few could pass it around with as much conviction as Mrs. Carmody. He told Steph they'd had a hard winter and a late spring, now a hot summer, and a storm that was over, urging her that she wasn't acting like herself. But she insisted in that same husky voice that it hadn't been an ordinary storm, and he agreed with her there. He recalled hearing the Black Spring story from Bill Giosty, who owned Giosty's Mobile in Casco Village, running the place with his 3 tosspot sons and occasional help from his 4 tosspot grandsons when they could take time off from tinkering with snowmobiles and dirt bikes. Bill was 70, looked 80, and could still drink like 23 when the mood was on him. David and Billy had taken the Scout in for a fill up the day, after a surprise mid-May storm dropped nearly a foot of wet, heavy snow covering new grass and flowers, and Giosty had been in his cups, happy to pass along the Black Spring story with his own original twist. But they got snow in May sometimes. It came and was gone 2 days later, no big deal. Steph was glancing doubtfully at the downed wires again, asking when the power company would come, and he assured her just as soon as they could, it wouldn't be long. He told her not to worry about Billy. His head was on pretty straight. He forgot to pick up his clothes, but he wasn't going to step on live lines. He had a good healthy dose of self-interest. He touched a corner of her mouth, and it obliged by turning up in the beginning of a smile, and she admitted he always made it seem better, which made him feel good. From the lakeside, Billy was yelling for them to come see, and David suggested they go look at the damage. Steph snorted ruefully that if she wanted to look at damage, she could go sit in her living room, so he urged her to make a little kid happy instead. They walked down the stone steps hand in hand and just reached the first turn when Billy came from the other direction at speed, almost knocking them over. Steph told him to take it easy, perhaps seeing in her mind him skidding into that deadly nest of live wires instead of the 2 of them. Billy panted out the news. The boathouse was all bashed. There was a dock on the rocks, trees in the boat cove, and he exclaimed, "Jesus Christ," earning a thunderous reprimand from his mother. He apologized but was gone again in his excitement. David quipped that the doomsayer had spoken and departed, making Steph giggle again, and told her after he cut up the trees across the driveway he'd go by the Central Maine Power Office on Portland Road to tell them what they had. She agreed gratefully, and asked when he thought he could go. He calculated that except for the big tree with a moldy corset of moss, it would be an hour's work, but with it, added in, he didn't think the job would be done until 11 or so. She said she'd give him lunch here, but he'd have to get some things at the market. They were almost out of milk and butter, and she'd have to make him a list. He thought about how giving a woman a disaster turned her squirrel, gave her a hug and nodded, and they went on around the house. It didn't take more than a glance to understand why Billy had been overwhelmed. From where they stood they had enough elevation to see almost a quarter-mile of shoreline, the Bibber property to their left, their own, and Norton's to their right. The huge old pine that had guarded their boat cove had been sheared off halfway up, what was left looking like a brutally sharpened pencil, the inside a glistening defenseless white against the age and weather. Darkened outer bark 100 feet of the old pine's top half lay partly submerged in their shallow cove. David realized they were very lucky their little star cruiser wasn't sunk underneath it the week before. It had developed engine trouble and was still at the Naples Marina patiently waiting its turn. On the other side of their shorefront, the boathouse his father had built, which had once housed a 60-foot Chris craft when the Drayton family fortunes had been higher, lay under another big tree, the one that had stood on Norton's side of the property line, he saw, raising the first flush of anger. The tree had been dead for 5 years, and Norton should have had it taken down long since. Now it was 3/4 of the way down, their boathouse propping it up, the roof taking on a drunken sway-backed look. Shingles swirled all over the point of land from the hole the tree had made. Billy's description, bashed, was as good as any. Steph exclaimed with hurt indignation that it was Norton's tree, and David had to smile in spite of the pain he felt. The flagpole was lying in the water, and Old Glory floated soggily beside it in a tangle of lanyard, and he could imagine Norton's response. "Sue me." Billy was on the rock breakwater examining a dock that had washed up on the stones, painted in jaunty blue and yellow stripes, and he yelled gleefully that it was the Martinses, which David confirmed, asking Billy to wade in and fish the flag out. To the right of the breakwater was a small sandy beach that his father had trucked in back in 1941, 6 dump trucks full, spread to a depth of about 5 feet, the workmen charging $80, and the sand had never moved, which was just as well since you couldn't put a sandy beach in on your land now. The EPA having forbidden it because sewerage runoff from the booming cottage building industry had killed most of the fish and made the rest unsafe to eat. They might upset the ecology of the lake, and it was against the law for anyone except land developers to do that. Billy went for the flag, then stopped, and at the same moment David felt Steph go rigid against him as he saw it himself. The Harrison side of the lake was gone, buried under a line of bright white mist like a fair weather cloud fallen to earth. His dream of the night before recurred, and when Steph asked what it was, the word that nearly jumped first from his mouth was God. You couldn't see even a hint of the shoreline over there, but years of looking at Long Lake made him believe it wasn't hidden by much, only yards, maybe the edge of the mist nearly ruler straight. Billy yelled from the water up to his knees, groping for the soggy flag, asking what it was, and David said it was a fog bank. Steph asked doubtfully if it could be fog on the lake, and he could see Mrs. Carmody's influence in her eyes. Damn the woman, his own moment of unease was passing, since dreams after all were insubstantial things, like mist itself. He assured her they'd seen fog on the lake before, but she insisted never like that. It looked more like a cloud. He offered that it was the brightness of the sun, the same way clouds look from an airplane when you flew over them, and she pressed on what would cause it, noting they only got fog in damp weather. He said they'd got it right now. Harrison did anyway, just a little left over from the storm, 2 fronts meeting, something along that line. She asked if he was sure, and he laughed and hauled his arm around her neck, admitting he was bullshitting like crazy. If he was sure, he'd be doing the weather on the 6 o'clock news, and told her to go make her shopping list. She gave him one more doubtful glance, looked at the fog bank for a moment with the flat of her hand shading her eyes, shook her head with the word, "Weird," and walked away. For Billy, the mist had lost its novelty. He'd fished the flag and lanyard out of the water, and they spread it on the lawn to dry. Billy informed his father in a businesslike tone that he'd heard it was wrong to ever let the flag touch the ground, that Victor McAllister said they electrocuted people for it. David told him to tell Vic he was full of what made the grass grow green, and Billy supplied the word horseshit, though David had to remind him not to tell his mother he said so. He said they'd put the flag away when it was dry, even fold it into a cocked hat to be on safe ground there. Billy asked anxiously if they'd fix the boathouse roof and get a new flagpole, maybe having had enough destruction for a while, and David clapped him on the shoulder, affirming they certainly would. Billy asked if he could go over to the Bibbers to see what happened there, and David said just for a couple of minutes, warning that they'd be cleaning up too, and sometimes that made people feel ugly the way he presently felt about Norton. Billy bounded off, and David called after him to stay out of their way, adding a reminder about the live wires, and Billy assured him he would. He stood there a moment longer, surveying the damage, and then glancing back at the mist. It seemed closer, though he couldn't tell for certain if it was. It defied the laws of nature, because the gentle breeze was blowing against it, which was patently impossible. The fog was incredibly white, almost like fresh fallen snow, in dazzling contrast to the deep blue winter sky, except snow reflected hundreds of diamond points in the sun, while this peculiar fog bank, bright and clean-looking as it was, didn't sparkle at all. Despite what Steph had said, mist wasn't uncommon on clear days, but when there was a lot of it, The suspended moisture almost always caused a rainbow, yet here there was none. The unease tugged at him again, but before it could deepen he heard a low mechanical chuffing sound, followed by a barely audible curse. The sound repeated, then again with a stronger oath, in that I'm all by myself, but boy am I pissed tone. After a fourth chuff and a moment of silence came another muttered epithet. David began to grin. Recognizing the not-so-dulcet tones of his next-door neighbor Brenton Norton, sound carried well out here, and all the buzzing chainsaws were fairly distant. He moved closer to the water, pretending to stroll toward the beach dock, and spotted Norton in the clearing beside his screened-in porch, standing on a carpet of old pine needles in paint-spotted jeans and a white strappy t-shirt, his $40 haircut in disarray and sweat pouring down his face. Norton was down on one knee, laboring over his own chainsaw, much bigger and fancier than David's little-value house job, seemingly equipped with everything but a starter button yanking the cord and producing only those listless sounds. David was gladdened to see a yellow birch had fallen across Norton's picnic table and smashed it in two. Norton gave a tremendous yank, the saw almost catching but not quite, then another Herculean tug with the same result, and he whispered a fierce obscenity at his fancy chainsaw. David went back around the house, feeling genuinely good for the first time since getting up, and his own saw started on the first tug. Around 10 o'clock, Billy tapped his shoulder with a can of beer in one hand and Steph's list in the other. David stuffed the list in his back pocket, took the beer not frosty but at least cool, chugged almost half at once, and tipped the can in salute to Billy. Billy asked for some, took a swallow, grimaced, and handed it back. David finished the rest and caught himself just as he started to crush the can, old habits dying hard despite the deposit law being in effect for over 3 years. Billy reported that his mother had written something across the bottom of the list, but he couldn't read her handwriting. David pulled it out again and read her note about not being able to get Waxo on the radio, asking if the storm had knocked them off the air. Waxo was the local automated FM rock outlet broadcasting from Norway, about 20 miles north, the only station their old FM receiver would pull in. He told Billy to tell her probably, and ask if she could get Portland on the AM band. Billy asked if he could come when David went to town, and David said sure, him and Mommy both if they wanted. He'd worked his way up to the big tree, made his first cut, then turned the saw off for a few moments to let it cool. The tree was too big for it, but he thought it would be all right if he didn't rush. He wondered if the dirt road leading to Kansas Road was clear, and just as he wondered, an orange CMP truck lumbered past. So that was all right. The road was clear, and the power guys would be here by noon to take care of the live lines. He cut a big chunk off the tree, dragged it to the side of the driveway, and tumbled it over the edge, watching it roll down the slope into the underbrush that had crept back since the long-ago day when his dad and his brothers, all of them artists, the Dragons had always been an artistic family, had cleared it away. He wiped sweat off his face with his arm and wished for another beer. One really only set your mouth. He picked up the chainsaw and thought about Waxo being off the air, which was the direction the funny fog bank had come from, and also the direction Shaymore lay where the Arrowhead Project was. That had been old Bill Giostti's theory about the so-called Black Spring, the Arrowhead Project, in the western part of Shaymore, not far from where the town bordered Stoneham. There was a small government preserve surrounded with wire, with sentries and closed-circuit television cameras, and God knew what else, though David had never actually seen it. No one knew for sure where the name came from or if that was even the real name. Bill Giostti said there was a project, but got vague when asked how he knew, mentioning his niece who worked for the Continental Phone Company and had heard things. Bill had leaned in the scout's window that day, blowing Pabst into David's face, saying they were fooling around with atomic things up there, shooting atoms into the air and all that. Billy had piped up that the air was full of atoms. That's what Mrs. Neary said, and Bill Giostti had given him a long, bloodshot glance that deflated him, insisting these were different atoms. Billy had muttered his surrender. Dick Mueller, their insurance agent, said the Arrowhead Project was an agricultural station for bigger tomatoes with a longer growing season, while Janine Lawless, the post lady, said it was a geological survey involving shale oil. Mrs. Carmody now, she probably leaned more to Bill Giostti's view, not just atoms, but different atoms. David cut 2 more chunks off the big tree before Billy returned with a fresh beer and another note from Steph. He thanked Billy. Let him have 1 swallow since he'd taken 2 last time, and couldn't have him running around drunk at 10 in the morning, quarter past. Billy corrected shyly, and David smiled back at his son's rare joke. He read Steph's note saying she'd gotten JBQ on the radio, warning him not to get drunk before going to town. He could have 1 more, but that was it, before lunch, and asking if he could get up their road okay. He handed the note back and took his beer, telling Billy to tell her the road was okay because a power truck had just gone by, and they'd be working their way up here. Billy started to run off, and David called him back to tell her everything's okay. Billy smiled, maybe telling himself first, and ran off. David watched him go, legs pumping, soles of his Zori showing, and felt a wave of love. It was his son's face, and the way his eyes turned up, that made him believe things were really okay. Even though it was a lie, things were not okay, and never had been. He drank some beer, set the can down carefully on a rock, and got the chainsaw going again. About 20 minutes later, he felt a light tap on his shoulder and turned, expecting Billy. But it was Brent Norton. He turned off the saw. Norton didn't look the way he usually did. He looked hot and tired and unhappy and a little bewildered. David greeted him uncertainly, their last words having been hard ones, and had the funny feeling Norton had been standing behind him for the last 5 minutes or so, clearing his throat decorously under the chainsaw's roar. He hadn't gotten a really good look at Norton this summer. He'd lost weight, but it didn't look good. Not the way it should have, given the extra 20 pounds he'd been carrying. His wife had died the previous November, cancer, Aggie Bibber had told Steffi, and from the casual way Norton had always ragged and belittled her, David would have guessed he'd be glad to have her gone, maybe show up with a girl 20 years younger and a silly grin. But instead of that grin, there was only a new batch of age lines, the weight coming off in all the wrong places, leaving sags and folds and dewlaps that told their own story. For one passing moment, David wanted only to lead Norton to a patch of sun, sit him beside one of the fallen trees with a beer in his hand, and do a charcoal sketch of him. Norton finally spoke after a long, awkward silence made even louder by the absence of the chainsaw's racket, blurting out that the tree was his fault and he was sorry. David had been right. David shrugged. Then Norton added that another tree had fallen on his car. David started to express his sympathy. Then a horrible suspicion dawned, and he asked if it was the T-Bird. Norton confirmed it was that beloved 1960 Thunderbird in mint condition with only 30,000 miles, deep midnight blue inside and out, driven only in summers, and then rarely. Loved the way some men loved electric trains or model ships or target shooting pistols. David said that was a bitch and meant it. Norton shook his head slowly, explaining he'd almost brought the station wagon instead, but then decided what the hell. And now a big old rotten pine had fallen on it, the roof all bashed in. He thought he'd cut up the tree but couldn't get his chainsaw to fire up $200 for that sucker, and his throat began to emit little clicking sounds, his mouth working as if he were toothless and chewing dates. And for one helpless second, David thought he was going to just stand there and bawl like a kid on a sandlot. Then Norton got himself under some halfway control, shrugged, and turned away as if to look at the chunks of wood David had cut up. David offered to look at his saw and asked if the T-Bird was insured, and Norton said yeah. Like his boathouse, David saw what he meant, remembering what Steph had said about insurance. Norton wondered if he could borrow the saw to run up to town for bread and cold cuts and a lot of beer, and David told him Billy and he were going up in the Scout. He could come along if he gave a hand dragging the rest of the tree off to one side. Norton said he'd be happy to, grabbed one end but couldn't quite lift it, and David had to do most of the work between them. They tumbled it into the underbrush, Norton puffing and panting, his cheeks nearly purple, and David worried about his ticker after all that yanking on the chainsaw starter. He asked if Norton was okay, got a nod, and invited him back to the house for a beer. Norton thanked him and asked how Stephanie was, regaining some of the old smooth pomposity David disliked, and David said she was very well, and his son was fine too. Steph came out, and surprise passed over her face when she saw who was with David. Norton smiled, and his eyes crawled over her tight t-shirt. He hadn't changed that much after all. She greeted him cautiously, and Billy poked his head out from under her arm. David told her about Norton's T-bird taking a pretty good rap in the storm, the roof stove in, and she exclaimed in dismay. Norton told the story again while drinking one of their beers, and David sipped a third but had no buzz on, apparently sweating it out as fast as he drank it. He told Steph that Norton was coming to town with Billy and him, and she said she wouldn't expect them for a while. They might have to go to the shop and save in Norway if the power was off in Bridgeton. Billy piped up that cash registers ran on electricity. She asked if he still had the list, and he patted his hip pocket. Her eyes shifted to Norton and she offered condolences about Carla, which he accepted with a formal thank you. Another awkward silence fell, broken by Billy asking if they could go now, having changed into jeans and sneakers. David said yeah, they could, and asked Norton if he was ready. Norton asked for another beer for the road, and Steph's brow creased. She'd never approved of that philosophy, or of men driving with a beer can leaning against their crotches. David gave her a bare nod and she shrugged, getting him a beer rather than reopening things with Norton now. Norton thanked her in that dismissive way you thank a waitress, then told David to lead on. David went into the living room, Norton following and exclaiming over the birch, but David wasn't interested in that or the cost of replacing the window. He was looking at the lake through the sliding glass panel. The breeze had freshened, and the day had warmed up while he was cutting wood, and he'd thought the odd mist would surely have broken up, but it hadn't. It was closer, halfway across the lake now. Norton pontificated that it was some kind of temperature inversion. David didn't like it. Feeling strongly, he'd never seen a mist exactly like this one, partly the unnerving straight edge of its leading front, since nothing in nature was that even, and partly the pure dazzling whiteness with no variation and no sparkle of moisture. It was only half a mile off now, the contrast between it and the blues of the lake and sky more striking than ever. Billy tugged at his pants, eager to go, and they all went back to the kitchen. Norton glanced at the tree in the living room, and Billy remarked brightly that too bad it wasn't an apple tree, repeating what his mom had said and asking if it wasn't pretty funny. Norton said she was a real card and ruffled Billy's hair perfunctorily, his eyes going to Steph's t-shirt again. No, David thought. He was not a man he was ever going to really like. He asked Steph why she didn't come with them, suddenly wanting her to come along for no concrete reason, but she said she'd stay and pull weeds in the garden, noting that she seemed to be the only thing around that didn't run on electricity. Norton laughed too heartily. David tried one more time, but she was firm, saying the bend and stretch would do her good. He warned her not to get too much sun. She said she'd put on her straw hat, and they'd have sandwiches when he got back. She turned her face up to be kissed, telling him to be careful of blowdowns on Kansas Road, and he said he would. She told Billy to be careful too and kissed his cheek. Billy banged out the door and the screen cracked shut behind him. Norton and David walked out after him, and David suggested they go over to Norton's place and cut the tree off his bird, suddenly thinking of lots of reasons to delay leaving for town. Norton said he didn't even want to look at it until after lunch and a few more beers. The damage had been done. Dave, old buddy, and David didn't like being called buddy either. They all got into the front seat of the Scout, David backing out and crunching over storm-blown twigs, while Steph stood on the cement path leading to the vegetable patch, clippers in one gloved hand and weeding claw in the other, wearing her old floppy sun hat that cast a band of shadow over her face. David tapped the horn twice lightly, and she raised the hand holding the clippers in answer. They pulled out. He hasn't seen his wife since then. They had to stop once on the way up to Kansas Road since the power truck had driven through. A fair-sized pine had dropped across the road. Norton and David got out and moved it, enough to inch the Scout by, getting their hands all pitchy in the process. Billy wanted to help, but David waved him back, afraid he might get poked in the eye. Old trees had always reminded David of the Ents from Tolkien's Ring saga, only Ents that had gone bad. They wanted to hurt you. Didn't matter if you were snowshoeing, cross-country skiing, or just taking a walk in the woods, and he thought they'd kill you if they could. Kansas Road itself was clear, but in several places they saw more lines down about a quarter-mile past the Vicky Lynn campground. There was a power pole lying full length in the ditch, heavy wires snarled around its top like wild hair. Norton observed solemnly that it was some storm, and David agreed. Billy pointed at the remains of the Ellich's barn for 12 years. It had been sagging tiredly in Tommy Ellich's back field, up to its hips in sunflowers, goldenrod, and lolly come see me, and every fall David would think it couldn't last another winter, yet every spring it would still be there, but not anymore. All that remained was a splintered wreckage, and a roof mostly stripped of shingles. Its number had come up, and for some reason that echoed solemnly. Even ominously inside him the storm had come and smashed it flat. Norton drained his beer, crushed the can, and dropped it indifferently to the floor of the Scout. Billy opened his mouth to say something and then closed it again. Good boy. Norton came from New Jersey, where there was no bottle and can law, and David supposed he could be forgiven for squashing the nickel when he could barely remember not to do it himself. Billy started fiddling with the radio, and David asked him to see if Waxhaw was back on the air. He dialed to FM 92 and got nothing but a blank hum, shrugging. David thought about what other stations were on the far side of that peculiar fog front and told Billy to try WBLM. He dialed down the band, passing WJBQ and Wiggy on the way. Both were there, doing business as usual, but WBLM, Maine's premier progressive rock station, was off the air. David remarked that it was funny, then dismissed it when Norton asked, saying he was just thinking out loud. Billy had already tuned back to the musical serial on WJBQ, and soon enough they reached town. The Nordwashateria in the shopping center was closed. Impossible to run a coin-op laundry without electricity, but both the Bridgeton Pharmacy and the Federal Food Supermarket were open. The parking lot was fairly full, as always in midsummer, with many out-of-state plates, and little knots of people stood here and there in the sun, discussing the storm in gender-separated clusters. David spotted Mrs. Carmody, the woman of stuffed animals and stump water lore, sailing into the supermarket in an amazing canary yellow pantsuit, a purse the size of a small suitcase slung over her forearm. Then a reckless idiot on a Yamaha roared past, missing the front bumper by scant inches, wearing a denim jacket, mirror sunglasses and no helmet, prompting Norton to growl an observation about his stupidity. David circled the parking lot once, finding no spaces, and was resigning himself to a long walk from the far end, when he got lucky. A lime green Cadillac the size of a small cabin cruiser eased out of a slot closest to the market's doors, and he slid into the space the moment it was gone. He gave Billy Steph's shopping list, since the 5-year-old could read printing, and told him to get a cart and get started while he called his mother. Norton would help, and he'd be right along. Billy immediately grabbed Norton's hand as they got out. He'd been taught not to cross the parking lot without holding an adult's hand and hadn't yet lost the habit, and Norton looked surprised for a moment, then smiled a little, almost making David forgive him for the way he'd been looking at Steph. The two of them went into the market. David strolled over to the payphone on the wall between the drugstore and the Norge, where a sweltering woman in a purple sunsuit was jogging the cutoff switch up and down. He stood behind her with his hands in his pockets, wondering why he felt so uneasy about Steph, and why that unease was wrapped up with a line of white but unsparkling fog, the radio stations off the air, and the Arrowhead Project. The woman, sunburned and freckled on her fat shoulders like a sweaty orange baby, slammed the phone down, turned, and saw him, advising him to save his dime because there was nothing but da-da-da, then walked grumpily away. David almost slapped his forehead. The phone lines were down someplace, of course, some underground, but nowhere near all of them. He tried the phone anyway, but as the woman had said, there was no dial tone, just that same sound, which saved him his dime on what Steph called the paranoid payphones that cut off until you inserted your coin. He hung up and walked slowly toward the market. Just in time, he saw an amusing incident. An elderly couple walked toward the indoor chatting, and still chatting, they walked right into it, stopping mid-sentence as the woman squawked in surprise. They stared at each other comically, then laughed, and the old man pushed the heavy electric eye door open with some effort, since the electricity was off, catching you in 100 different ways. David pushed the door open himself and immediately noticed the lack of air conditioning, usually cranked up enough to give you frostbite if you stayed more than an hour. The Federal was constructed like a Skinner box. modern marketing techniques turning customers into white rats, with staples like bread, milk, meat, beer, and frozen dinners all on the far side, requiring you to walk past every impulse item known to modern man, from cricket lighters to rubber dog bones. Beyond the inn door was the fruit and vegetable aisle, but there was no sign of Norton or his son. The old lady who'd run into the door was examining grapefruits, her husband producing a net sack for purchases. David walked up the aisle and went left, finding them in the third aisle, Billy mulling over Jell-O packages and instant puddings while Norton stood behind him peering at the list, and David had to grin at his nonplussed expression. He threaded his way past half-loaded carriages and browsing shoppers, and Norton took 2 cans of pie filling from the top shelf. David asked how they were doing, and Norton looked around with unmistakable relief, saying they were all right. Billy confirmed, but couldn't resist adding smugly that there was lots of stuff Mr. Norton couldn't read either. David took the list. Norton had made neat lawyerly checks beside half a dozen items they'd picked up, including milk and a 6-pack of Coke, with maybe 10 other things she wanted, and said they ought to go back to fruits and vegetables for tomatoes and cucumbers. Billy started to turn the cart around, but Norton suggested David go look at the checkout. He went, and had a look, only 2 lanes open, a double line of people waiting that stretched past the mostly denuded bread racks and made a jig to the right out of sight along the frozen food coolers, all the new computerized NCRS hooded. At each open position, a harried-looking girl totted up purchases on a battery-powered pocket calculator, supervised by one of the 2 managers, Bud Brown, who seemed to fancy himself the Charles de Gaulle of the supermarket world, and Ollie Weeks, whom David liked. As each girl finished, the manager paperclipped a chit to the customer's cash or check and tossed it into a box used as a cash repository. They all looked hot and tired. Norton joined him, observing that they'd be in line for a while. David thought again of Steph at home alone, another flash of unease, and told Norton to go on and get his stuffed Billy, and he could handle the rest. Norton offered to grab more beers, but David declined, not wanting to spend the afternoon getting drunk with him, not with the mess things were in around the house, and Norton's face stiffened a little as he walked off shortly. David watched him go, and then Billy tugged at his shirt, asking if he'd talk to Mommy. David said no. The phone wasn't working, those lines were down too. Billy asked if he was worried about her, and David lied, saying no, of course not, then asked Billy the same. Billy said no, ooh, but his face had a pinched look. David thought they should have gone back then, but even then, it might have been too late. They worked their way back to the fruits and vegetables like salmon fighting upstream, and David spotted familiar faces. Mike Hatlin, one of the selectmen, Mrs. Repler from the grammar school, who had terrified generations of third-graders, currently sneering at the cantaloupes, Mrs. Turman, who sometimes babysat Billy. But mostly they were summer people, stocking up on no-cook items and joshing each other about roughing it. The cold cuts had been picked over thoroughly, with nothing left but a few packages of bologna, some macaroni loaf, and one lonely phallic kielbasa sausage. He got tomatoes, cucumbers, and a jar of mayonnaise. And though she'd wanted bacon, all the bacon was gone, so he picked up some bologna as a substitute, even though he'd never been able to eat it with any real enthusiasm since the FDA reported each package contained a small amount of insect filth. Rounding the corner into the fourth aisle, Billy pointed out some army guys, 2 of them in dun uniforms, standing out against the bright summer clothes, looking hardly old enough to shave, a scattering of personnel they'd gotten used to seeing with the Arrowhead Project only 30 miles or so away. David glanced at Steph's list and saw they had almost everything at the bottom. As an afterthought, she'd scribbled, "Bottle of Lancers," which sounded good to him, a couple of glasses of wine tonight after Billy had sacked out, then maybe a long, slow bout of love-making before sleep. He left the cart and worked his way down to the wine aisle, grabbing a bottle, and as he walked back, he passed the big double doors to the storage area, hearing the steady roar of a generator, probably just big enough to keep the cold cases cold, but not large enough to power the doors and cash registers, sounding like a motorcycle back there. Norton appeared just as they got in line, balancing 2 6-packs of Schlitz Light, a loaf of bread, and the kielbasa David had spotted earlier, and he joined them. It seemed very warm in the market with the air conditioning off, and David wondered why none of the stock boys had at least chalked the doors open. He'd seen Buddy Eagleton in his red apron 2 aisles back, doing nothing and piling it up. The generator roared monotonously, and David felt the beginnings of a headache. He told Norton to put his stuff in the cart before he dropped something, and Norton thanked him. The lines were up past the frozen food now. People having to cut through with much excuse meing and pardon meing, and Norton remarked morosely that this was going to be a problem, using rougher language than David liked Billy to hear. The generator's roar muted a little as the line shuffled forward, and Norton and David made desultory conversation, skirting the ugly property dispute and sticking with things like the Red Sox's chances and the weather, until they exhausted their small talk and fell silent as Billy fidgeted beside him. The line crawled along, frozen dinners on their right, and more expensive wines and champagnes on their left. As they progressed down to the cheaper wines, David toyed briefly with picking up a bottle of Ripple, the wine of his flaming youth. But didn't his youth never flame that much anyway? Billy asked why they couldn't hurry up, the pinched look still on his face, and suddenly, briefly, the mist of disquiet that had settled over David rifted, and something terrible peered through from the other side the bright and metallic face of terror then passed. He told Billy to keep cool. They'd made it up to the bread racks where the double line bent left, and could see the checkout lanes now 2 open, 4 deserted with signs reading, "Please choose another lane," and Winston on the stationary conveyor belts. Beyond the lanes was the big section plate glass window giving a view of the parking lot and the intersection of routes 117 and 302, partially obscured by white paperbacks of signs advertising specials and the latest giveaway, a set of books called the Mother Nature Encyclopedia. They were in the line leading to Bud Brown's checkout, with maybe 30 people in front of them, the easiest to pick out being Mrs. Carmody in her blazing yellow pantsuit, looking like an advertisement for yellow fever. Suddenly, a shrieking noise began in the distance, building to the crazy warble of a police siren. A horn blared at the intersection with a shriek of brakes and burning rubber. David couldn't see the angle, but the siren reached its loudest as it approached the market, and then began to fade as the police car went past. A few people broke out of line to look, but not many. They'd waited too long to chance losing their places. Norton went to see and came back saying it was local fuzz. Then the town fire whistle began to wail, slowly cranking up to a shriek, falling off, then rising again, and Billy clutched David's hand, asking what it was and immediately if Mommy was all right. Norton suggested, "It must be a fire on Kansas Road from those damned live lines from the storm, and the fire trucks would go through in a minute." That gave David's disquiet something to crystallize on. There were live lines down in their own yard. Bud Brown said something to the checker he was supervising as she craned around to see, and she flushed, returning to her calculator. David didn't want to be in this line suddenly. He very badly didn't want to be in it. But it was moving again, and it seemed foolish to leave now they'd gotten down by the cartons of cigarettes. Someone pushed through the inn door, a teenager, maybe the kid they'd almost hit coming in on the Yamaha with no helmet, yelling about the fog rolling right up Kansas Road, panting as if he'd run a long distance. People eyed him, but no one wanted to lose their place in line. A few who hadn't reached the lines yet left their carts and strolled through empty checkout lanes to see what he was talking about, and a big guy in a summer hat yanked open the outdoor, with several people, 10, maybe a dozen, going out with him, the kid along. One of the army guys cracked that they shouldn't let out all the air conditioning, getting a few chuckles, but David wasn't chuckling. He'd seen the mist coming across the lake. Norton suggested Billy go have a look, but David said no at once, for no concrete reason. The line moved forward again as people craned their necks looking for the fog, but there was nothing but bright blue sky. Someone said the kid must have been joking. Someone else responded he'd seen a funny line of mist on Long Lake not an hour ago. The first whistle whooped and screamed, sounding like big league doom blowing that way. More people went out, some even leaving their places in line, speeding things up a bit. Then grizzled old John Lee Froven, a mechanic at the Texaco station, ducked in and yelled for anyone with a camera, then ducked back out, causing a rush. If it was worth taking a picture of, it was worth seeing. Suddenly, Mrs. Carmody cried in her rusty, powerful voice not to go out there, and people turned to look at her. The orderly shape of the lines had grown fuzzy, as people left to look at the mist, or drew away from Mrs. Carmody, or milled around seeking friends. A pretty young woman in a cranberry sweatshirt and dark green slacks was studying Mrs. Carmody thoughtfully, while a few opportunists took advantage to move up a couple of places. The checker beside Bud Brown looked over her shoulder again, and Brown tapped her shoulder, telling her to keep her mind on what she was doing. Mrs. Carmody yelled again that it was death out there. She felt it was death. Bud and Ollie Weeks, who both knew her, looked impatient and irritated, but any summer people around her stepped smartly away, never minding their places in line, like the effect bag ladies in big cities have on people, as if they were carriers of some contagious disease. Things began to happen at an accelerating, confusing pace. A man staggered into the market, shoving the inn door open, his nose bleeding, screaming that something in the fog had taken John Lee, and he'd heard him screaming. And Billy shrank against David. He staggered back against a display of lawn food and sat down. The situation changed, made nervous by the storm, the police siren and fire whistle, the subtle dislocation any power outage causes in the American psyche, and the steadily mounting atmosphere of unease as things somehow changed. People began to move in a body. It wasn't exactly a panic. They didn't bolt or run, at least most of them didn't, but they went. Some just went to the big show window to look out. Others went out, the indoor still carrying their intended purchases, and Bud Brown, harried and officious, began yelling at them to come back with those hot dog rolls. They hadn't paid for them. The laughter that erupted was jagged and unhinged, a yodeling burst from someone in the crowd that pulled uneasy smiles from the faces around him, though those smiles sat atop expressions of deepening confusion. Another laugh followed, and Bud Brown's cheeks flushed a mottled red. He lunged, snatching a box of mushrooms from a woman pressing past him toward the windows, and she shrieked a demand for their return, using a childish nickname for the vegetables. Nearby, two men dissolved into helpless, cackling fit sounds that belonged in an asylum, not a grocery store. Mrs. Carmody's voice cut through again, a hoarse warning against stepping outside, while the town fire whistle continued its frantic rhythmic wail, like a panicked old woman who discovered an intruder. Billy broke then, tears spilling down his cheeks as he pointed at the bloodied man who had stumbled inside moments before, asking his father what he was and why he looked that way. David soothed him quickly, blaming the blood on a simple nosebleed, but Norton interjected with a ponderous frown, trying to make sense of the earlier claims about something lurking in the fog. Billy, still crying, begged to go home. A rough jostle from behind nearly knocked David off balance, and he scooped his son up, feeling his own dread rising to match the growing chaos. The checker Sally tried to flee her post, but Brown grabbed the collar of her smock. The fabric tore, and she lashed out with clawing hands, screaming obscenities. He fired back a dismissive insult, sounding more stunned than angry, and when he reached for her again, Ollie Weeks intervened with a sharp command to stand down. A fresh scream pierced the air, and the crowd's restraint evaporated. People flooded toward both exits, spilling out into the parking lot. Glass shattered somewhere and soda foamed across the tiles. Norton's bewildered question hung in the air, unanswered. The dimming light tricked David's eyes. At first, he assumed the fluorescence had finally failed, and he wasn't alone in that reflexive glance upward. But the power had been out all along, and the market had never been this dark before. Then he understood, even before the people pressed against the glass began shouting and pointing. The mist was arriving. It rolled in from the Kansas Road entrance, the same unnerving white he'd spotted across the lake hours ago, bright, but utterly without reflection. It moved fast, swallowing the sun until only a pale silver disk remained, like a winter moon behind thin clouds. The speed was deceptive, lazy and hypnotic, the same terrible grace he'd seen in the waterspout the night before. These forces of nature had a way of mesmerizing you, holding you fixed as they advanced. The mist erased the two-lane blacktop without effort, then consumed the McKeon's restored colonial in a single smooth sweep. The second floor of the neighboring apartment building jutted out briefly, a last defiance, and then vanished. The Keep Right sign dissolved, its black lettering floating for a moment in the whiteness before disappearing entirely. One by one the cars in the lot began to fade. Norton repeated his question, his voice now cracking with genuine fear. The mist pressed on, devouring blue sky and blacktop with equal hunger. The line of its advance perfectly straight even 20 feet away. Watching it felt surreal, like a special effect from a Hollywood film, too clean and total to be real. The blue shrank to a stripe, then a pencil line, then nothing. Blank white pressed against the show window. David could see no farther than the litter barrel 4 feet away, and only the front bumper of his Scout remained visible beyond that. A woman's scream rang out, long and piercing, and Billy pressed himself against David's chest, trembling like a live wire. A man broke from the crowd and bolted through an empty checkout lane toward the door, and that was the spark. The crowd surged, a stampede of bodies pouring into the fog. Brown bellowed after them, his voice cracking between anger and fear, veins bulging on his purple face as he accused them of shoplifting. Some dropped their goods, others kept running, laughing or shouting, but the laughing ones were the minority. They vanished into the white, and none of them would ever be seen again. A faint, acrid odor drifted through the open door. People jammed at the threshold, pushing and shoving, and David's shoulders ached from the weight of his son. He switched Billy to his other arm just as Norton began drifting toward the exit, his expression distant and unreadable. David reached out, catching his arm. He warned him to wait, see what happened. Norton turned, confused, asking what there was to see. David admitted he didn't know. Before Norton could press further, a shriek tore through the fog and he fell silent. The crowd at the outdoor stalled, then reversed itself. The babble of voices died abruptly. Faces turned flat and pale, drained of dimension. The shriek continued impossibly, competing with the fire whistle's rise and fall, seeming to draw on infinite reserves of air. Norton whispered a prayer and raked his hands through his hair. The shriek cut off without warning, not fading, but simply extinguished. A beefy man in work pants pushed outside, perhaps intent on rescue. For an instant he was visible through the glass, a ghost in the milk-white murk. Then beyond him something shifted, a gray shape in all that white, and the man was jerked backward, his hands flying up as if in astonishment. David was certain he was the only one who saw it. Silence fell over the market like a shroud. Outside, sodium lights flickered on across the parking lot, their underground cables still feeding them power. Mrs. Carmody's voice rang out again, a gore-crow's warning. It was death to go out there. This time, no one argued or laughed. Another scream drifted in from the distance, muffled and strange. Billy stiffened against his father once more. Ollie Weeks approached, his round face beaded with sweat, asking what was happening. David admitted he had no idea. Ollie looked deeply frightened, and David noted briefly the sapphire ring on his finger, won in a lottery, worn as a talisman against a life he seemed uneasy with. He told Ollie that he had to set Billy down, but would keep hold of his hand, his arms going numb. Billy whispered for his mother, and David offered a hollow reassurance. An old man shuffled past, bundled in a heavy sweater, declaring the fog a pollution cloud from the Rumford Mills before vanishing down the aisles. Norton suggested they leave, his voice carrying no conviction at all. Then the floor shuddered beneath them, a deep, twisting impact that David felt through his soles, as if the building had dropped 3 feet. Bottles clattered from shelves, shattering against tile. A wedge of glass fell from the show window, and David saw that the wooden frames holding the panes had buckled and splintered. The fire whistle cut off mid-whoop. The silence that followed was the sound of people holding their breath, waiting for whatever came next. David's mind slipped sideways, recalling a winter thaw from his childhood, standing in his father's store, watching yellow fog press against the windows, the drip of meltwater, the shadow of dead flies in amber light. That memory passed slowly, reluctantly. Norton bellowed for attention, raising both hands like a candidate soliciting votes, warning that it might be dangerous outside. A woman screamed back, desperate to reach her children. Mrs. Carmody repeated her death sentence with practiced fervor, her face swelling grotesquely as she stood by the fertilizer sacks. A teenager shoved her onto the bags, shouting for her to stop her nonsense. Norton pleaded for patience, urging them to wait until the mist cleared enough to see. A flood of conflicting shouts answered him. David added his own voice, asking for calm. A bespectacled man murmured that they'd felt an earthquake. A local couple bickered over where the last one had hit. Billy began crying again, his voice rising in a demand for his mother. Brown snapped at David to quiet the boy, and David offered a sharp rejoinder, his patience fraying. Norton tried to mediate weakly. The woman who'd screamed earlier, a blonde mother, her face tired and pretty, explained in a rush of anxious words that her 8-year-old daughter was watching her toddler, that the girl might forget, that little Victor might turn on the stove or pull out plugs. Her voice cracked. She begged for someone to see her home. No one answered. Her eyes moved from face to face, finding nothing. She dismissed each of them with a dead, exhausted voice. Ollie, Brown, Norton, David himself, and walked to the door. A teenager tried to stop her, but she shook him off and slipped into the fog. They watched her fade, first to a sketch, then a ghost, then nothing. No one spoke. The crowd erupted in a chaotic jumble of shouted responses, voices overlapping and canceling each other out. David raised his own voice above the noise, urging everyone to stay calm, to hold steady. A soft-spoken man in glasses, still clutching a package of hamburger and buns in one hand, his daughter's small fingers in the other, insisted they'd just felt an earthquake. A heavy-set local man countered that they'd had one in Naples a few years back, but his wife corrected him with the brisk authority of someone who habitually set facts straight, insisting it had been Casco. He wavered, then conceded, and she closed the matter. A can, nudged to the edge of its shelf by the tremors, finally fell with a delayed clatter. Billy's composure shattered completely. He wailed for his mother, his voice raw and desperate. Brown snapped at David to silence the child, his eyes darting without focus, and David shot back with a threat that made Norton wince and urge restraint. The blonde woman who'd screamed earlier apologized for her distress, her voice trembling as she explained she couldn't stay. Her children were alone, her 8-year-old daughter watching the toddler, and the little one had a habit of playing with stove burners and electrical cords. Her words tumbled out in a breathless, fragmented rush, a mother's terror spilling over. She looked at the faces around her, searching for any sign of help, and saw only a wall of eyes. Her voice rose to a desperate shriek, begging for someone to see her home. No one answered. People shuffled, looked away. The fat local man took a hesitant step forward, but his wife yanked him back with a grip like iron. She turned to Ollie. He shook his head. To Brown, he covered his calculator with his palm and said nothing. To Norton, he began a measured legal response about caution and deliberation, but she dismissed him mid-sentence, and his words died. To David, he could only hold Billy tighter, using the boy as a shield against the raw agony in her face. She didn't scream her final curse. Her voice was hollow with exhaustion as she told them all to rot in hell, then pushed the outdoor open with both hands. David's throat was too dry to call after her. A teenager tried to stop her, touching her arm, but she looked at his hand and he withdrew. Shamed, she stepped into the fog. They watched her dissolve, first a human figure, then a sketch in pencil on white paper, then only the ghost of her red dress floating in limbo. Then even that was gone. Silence held them. Billy's hysteria peaked, his screams devolving into the formless anguish of a much younger child, tears and snot streaking his face. David led him away, down a middle aisle, arm around his shoulders, trying to soothe without words. He brought him to the long meat counter at the back, where Mr. McVeigh stood in his stained whites. They exchanged a nod, the only acknowledgement either could manage. David sat on the floor, pulling Billy onto his lap, pressing the boy's face to his chest, rocking him as he recited the standard parental reassurances, those practiced lies that sound so convincing to a child. Billy looked up, his eyes dark-circled and wet, and asked if the fog was normal. David admitted it wasn't. He couldn't lie about that. Billy drifted into sleep, his body surrendering to exhaustion the way children's do. They don't fight shock, they sink into it. David held him, wondering if the boy had sensed the night's coming terror even before it arrived, that old premonition that sometimes slips through the cracks. Once Billy was deeply under, David laid him on the floor and went in search of something to cover him. Most of the crowd still clustered at the front, peering into the mist. Norton had gathered a small audience, performing his persuasive routine. Brown stood rigid at his register. Ollie had abandoned his post. David pushed through the double doors into the storage area, where the generator thrummed behind its plywood partition. The smell of diesel fumes hit him immediately, thick and wrong. He walked toward the partition, breathing shallowly through the fabric of his unbuttoned shirt. The storage room stretched long and narrow, lit feebly by emergency lights. Cartons rose on all sides: bleach, soft drinks, beefaroni ketchup. One had spilled open, its contents bleeding across the floor. He unlatched the generator compartment and stepped inside. Blue smoke hung in oily clouds around the machine. The exhaust pipe, venting through a hole in the wall, must have been blocked at the outside end. He found a simple on-off switch and flipped it. The generator hitched, coughed, belched, and died. Its final pops a diminishing echo like Norton's chainsaw, he thought, that stubborn machine. The emergency lights faded, plunging him into total darkness. Fear struck fast, disorienting him. His breathing sounded loud and ragged in the confined space. He stumbled, bumping his nose on the plywood door, heart lurching. He found his way through the black-painted windows of the double doors, but the darkness was nearly absolute. He drifted off course, crashing into a stack of bleach cartons. One clipped his head, and he tripped over another, falling hard enough to see stars burst behind his eyes. He lay on the floor, rubbing his skull, cursing himself, forcing a mantra of calm. Get up, get out, get back to Billy. Nothing is going to grab you in the dark. He stood carefully, scanning for a pencil-thin line of light between the doors. He found it, a faint scratch on the blackness, and started toward it. Then he stopped. A sound reached him, soft, sliding, stealthy. It stopped, then resumed with a small bump. Every nerve in his body went cold. It wasn't coming from inside the market, it was behind him. Outside, from the mist, something was slipping and scraping over the cinder blocks, looking for a way in, or maybe it was already inside, searching for him in the dark. The thought froze his legs. The sound came again, and the quality shifted, a rasping scrape across the darkness that made his heart slam against his ribs. He lunged for the vertical line of light, hit the doors with his full weight, and burst through into the market. 3 or 4 people stood outside the double doors, including Ollie, who jumped back with a startled gasp, clutching his chest. He saw David's face, and his question changed mid-sentence, demanding to know what was wrong. David asked if they'd heard the sound, but they hadn't. They'd only come to investigate why the generator had stopped. A bag boy arrived with an armload of flashlights, eyeing David with a mix of curiosity and faint contempt. David explained that he'd turned the generator off because of the blocked exhaust, then described the scraping, slithering noise he'd heard in the dark. One of the men from the town road department, Jim something, suggested it was just nerves. David knew it wasn't. Another man asked if he'd heard it before the power went out. Only after, David said, and saw their faces close off, unwilling to accept more bad news. Only Ollie seemed to believe him. The bag boy urged them to restart the generator, handing out flashlights. Ollie accepted his doubtfully. The bag boy offered one to David, his eyes holding a faint challenge. After a moment, David took it. He still needed something to cover Billy. Ollie chalked the double doors open, letting in some light, and they surveyed the scattered bleach cartons around the half-open partition door. Jim sniffed the air, and confirmed the smell was bad enough to justify shutting the generator down, a reluctant concession. Flashlight beams cut through the drifting smoke, playing over stacked cartons of canned goods, toilet paper, and dog food, their light hazy and indistinct in the fumes. The bag boy swept his beam briefly toward the wide loading door at the far end. The 2 men and Ollie stepped into the generator compartment, their lights casting restless, nervous shadows that reminded David of the adventure story illustrations he'd done in College Pirates, burying treasure, mad doctors snatching bodies. The shadows on the walls twisted and grew monstrous as the beam shifted, and the generator ticked irregularly, cooling down. The bag boy walked toward the loading door, playing his light ahead, and David warned him not to go near it. The kid shot back a dismissive retort, and from the compartment, someone called to Ollie to try the generator again. It wheezed, roared, then someone shouted to kill it, the stench unbearable. The generator died. The bag boy returned just as the others emerged, and one of them confirmed that something had indeed blocked the exhaust. The bag boy's eyes gleamed with a reckless bravado, the same look David had drawn 100 times in frontispieces for boys' adventure tales. He proposed raising the loading door, going around and clearing the obstruction himself. Ollie voiced doubt, but the others dismissed his hesitation. Jim asked if the door was electric. Ollie admitted it was, but reiterated his concern. The other man, Myron, volunteered, tipping his cap back with easy confidence, and the argument shifted from whether to do it at all to who would do it. None of them had heard the slithering sound David had described. He shouted for them to stop, tried to make them understand that the fog was no ordinary weather, that no one had entered the market since it hit, that opening that door might let something in. Norm demanded to know what, his voice dripping with 18-year-old contempt. Jim dismissed David's warnings as confusion, suggesting the artist had merely gotten spooked in the dark. David's frustration boiled over. He jabbed back, pointing out that if they wanted to risk the outside, they should have started by seeing the desperate woman home. The men's eyes had that hard, reckless shine, the same look he'd seen on people going to shoot rats at the dump. Jim's buddy Myron flushed and reminded David they hadn't asked for his advice. Ollie tried once more, arguing the generator wasn't essential, the cold cases would hold for hours, but Jim cut him off, deciding Norm would do it. He'd start the motor, Norm would raise the door, and he and Myron would wait by the exhaust outlet. Norm bustled off, excited. David called after him, calling the plan crazy, but Myron shot back that David hadn't exactly rushed to escort the woman himself. Norm yelled at him to shut up. Jim turned cold, warning David to count his teeth if he had anything more to say. Ollie looked frightened. David shrugged, recognizing the truth. They were desperate for control, for a simple mechanical problem to solve, and they'd fix it no matter what. Jim and Myron went back into the compartment. Jim called out to Norm, asking if he was ready. Norm nodded, then remembered they couldn't see him and answered yes. David and Ollie both warned him it was a mistake. Norm's face suddenly looked young, scared, his Adam's apple bobbing. He opened his mouth as if to call it off, but the generator roared to life, and Norm lunged for the button beside the door. It rattled upward on steel tracks. The emergency lights dimmed as the lifting motor drained power, but daylight seeped in from outside, overcast, winter gray. The acrid smell was back. The door rose 2 feet, then 4. Beyond it, a concrete platform with yellow striped edges faded into impossible thickness of fog. Norm yelled to stop it. Tendrils of mist curled inside, white and delicate as lace, and the air turned cold, not the cool of a summer morning, but the biting chill of March. David shivered and thought of Steph. The generator died. Jim emerged just as Norm ducked under the door, and then they all saw it. A tentacle slid over the far edge of the platform and wrapped around Norm's calf. It tapered from the thickness of a grass snake, where it gripped his leg, to a massive girth of 4 or 5 feet, where it vanished into the mist, slate gray above, pinkish flesh below, lined with rows of puckering suckers that writhed like tiny mouths. Norm looked down, saw it, and his eyes bulged. He screamed for help, for someone to get it off him. Jim whimpered. Norm grabbed the door's edge and yanked himself back in, but the tentacle bulged with effort, dragging him backward until his head clanged against the steel. His shirt scraped up his back as the door's edge caught it. He pulled himself in again, chin-up style, sobbing for help. Myron emerged from the compartment, whispering a prayer. David was closest. He grabbed Norm around the waist and heaved, rocking on his heels. For a moment they moved backward, but only a moment. The tentacle yielded but held fast. Then 3 more tentacles emerged from the mist. One tore Norm's red apron away and disappeared with it. David's mind flashed to his mother's old saying about needing something like a hen needed a flag, and he started laughing, a sound indistinguishable from Norm's screams. The other tentacles slithered across the platform, making that scraping sound David had heard in the dark. One slapped around Norm's hip. David felt it brush his arm, warm, pulsing, smooth. It didn't grip him, but it took Norm. A third coiled around his other ankle. Now he was being pulled away. David shouted for help, for someone to grab him, but no one came. He looked down and saw the tentacle around Norm's waist working into his skin, the suckers eating into his flesh, blood seeping from the trench they'd carved. David's head banged against the raised door's edge. Norm's legs were outside now. One loafer had fallen off, and a new tentacle snatched it. Norm's fingers gripped the door's edge in a death hold, white-knuckled, his head whipping back and forth, his hair flying. He'd stopped screaming. He was beyond that. Over his shoulder, David saw more tentacles coming, dozens, a forest of them, some as thick as the moss-crusted tree that had fallen across his driveway that morning. The biggest had suckers the size of manhole covers. One of them struck the platform with a heavy rolling slap and inched toward them like a blind worm. David gave one final, desperate tug, and the tentacle on Norm's calf slipped a little, but only a little. Before it re-established its grip, David saw it was eating him away. The tentacle brushed his cheek, a delicate, almost hesitant touch, and hovered there, as if weighing something. David thought of Billy, sleeping by the meat cooler. He'd come back here to find something to cover him. If those things took him now, only Norton might be left to watch over his son. The thought drove him to release Norm and drop to his hands and knees. He crouched half in, half out beneath the raised door. A tentacle passed on his left, moving on its suckers like a crawling thing, and coiled around Norm's upper arm. Norm's body was now a writhing mass of tentacles, a nightmare tableau of serpentine coils, and they were all around David as well. He scrambled back inside in a clumsy leapfrog, landing on his shoulder and rolling. Jim, Ollie, and Myron stood frozen like wax figures, pale, and staring with two bright eyes, flanking the generator compartment. David screamed at them to start the generator, but they didn't move, hypnotized by the horror at the loading bay. He grabbed a box of bleach off the floor and hurled it into Jim's gut. The impact jolted Jim back to a semblance of awareness. David roared again, his throat raw, demanding action. Instead of moving, Jim began a whining, defensive explanation he hadn't understood. David hadn't made himself clear. He'd thought it might be a bird. Ollie finally shoved past him, shouldering into the generator room. Jim stumbled over a bleach carton and fell, his face cheese white, his eyes those of a terrified child. The generator coughed and rumbled to life. David turned back to the loading door. Norm was nearly gone, clinging with one hand, his body a boiling mass of tentacles, blood pattering onto the concrete in small, steady drops. His head thrashed, his eyes bulging with terror. Inside the storage area, more tentacles crept across the floor, too many near the door button to approach. One snatched a bottle of Pepsi, another crushed a carton, sending rolls of toilet paper geysering everywhere. Tentacles seized them eagerly. A massive one slithered inside, its tip rising to sniff the air, then advancing toward Myron, who stepped back with a high, frightened moan. David spotted a janitor's push broom leaning against beer cases and grabbed it. Norm's last hand was ripped loose. He thudded onto the platform, scrabbling madly, his eyes meeting David's for an instant, hellishly bright, fully aware of his fate. Then he was pulled, bumping and rolling into the mist, his final scream choked off. David jammed the broom handle onto the shut button. The door motor whined and the door began to descend. It met the thickest tentacle, the one investigating Myron, indenting its flesh, then piercing it. Black goo spurted. The tentacle writhed wildly, a bullwhip of obscene motion, then flattened and withdrew. The others followed. One, still clutching a bag of dog food, was severed by the descending door. The cut piece squeezed the bag open, spilling brown nuggets, then flopped on the floor like a dying fish before lying still. David prodded it with the broom. It clenched savagely once, then loosened and lay limp. Silence fell, broken only by the generator's roar and Ollie's sobs from inside the compartment. He sat on a stool, face in his hands. Then David heard it again, the soft, slithery sound now multiplied tenfold, as tentacles squirmed over the outside of the door, searching for a way in. Myron approached, stammering an appeal for understanding. David swung at him without thinking, his fist landing below his nose, splitting his lip against his teeth. He screamed at Myron, accusing him of getting Norm killed, and began pummeling wildly, not with technique, but with raw rage. Myron staggered back, taking some blows, his face a numb canvas of resignation. David bloodied his nose, raised a dark welt under his eye, landed a hard one on his chin. Myron's eyes went cloudy. He kept repeating the same word until David drove a fist into his stomach, and the air left him. He would have kept going, but someone grabbed his arms. Ollie, his face pale and tear-streaked, telling him to stop, that it solved nothing. Jim stood nearby, blank and bewildered. David kicked a carton at him, calling them both stupid assholes, blaming them for the boy's death. Jim looked down. Myron sat on the floor, clutching his belly. David sat down on a carton, head between his knees, gripping his legs, trembling, waiting for the nausea or blackness to pass. After a long moment, he looked up at Ollie, whose ring glinted in the emergency light. He said he was done. Ollie agreed they needed to think. David ordered him to shut the generator down. The exhaust was building again. Myron tried to apologize, but David cut him off, telling him and Jim to go back into the market and wait by the beer cooler, saying nothing to anyone. They shuffled out, huddling together. Ollie killed the generator, and as the lights failed, David spotted a quilted mover's pad over a stack of bottles and grabbed it for Billy. Ollie emerged from the compartment, wheezing, his voice wavering in the darkness. David guided him past the scattered bleach cartons, and Ollie's hand found his shoulder with a trembling sigh. He muttered about the oppressive dark. David agreed, but asked him to wait. He needed to talk without the other two listening. Ollie reminded him that Jim and Myron hadn't twisted Norm's arm, but David countered that Norm was a kid and they weren't. Still, he said it was over. They needed to tell the people in the market. Ollie worried about panic. David argued that the warning would make them think twice about leaving. Most had families at home, himself included. Ollie's grip tightened as he agreed, then asked the question that haunted him. What were those tentacles attached to? David admitted he didn't know, but insisted they tell the story themselves before the other two could start a panic. They shuffled toward the thin line of light between the swing doors, wary of obstacles. Ollie's hand clamped on David's forearm. As they reached the doors, Ollie said flatly that what they'd seen was impossible. Even a giant squid would die on land. David agreed. Then Ollie demanded to know what had happened, what the mist was. David had no answer. They went out. Jim and Myron stood just outside the storage doors, both clutching Budweisers, their faces slack with shock. David checked on Billy, still asleep, and covered him with a mover's pad. The boy stirred, muttered, then settled. David glanced at his watch. 12:15. The time felt impossible. It seemed hours had passed since he'd gone looking for something to cover his son, but the entire nightmare had lasted barely 35 minutes. He rejoined Ollie, Jim, and Myron. Ollie offered him a beer. David took it and gulped half in one long swallow, the way he'd drunk that morning while cutting wood. It steadied him. He noted the blood drying on Myron's face. Le Fleur, the flower, with a swelling eye and split lip. A girl in a cranberry sweatshirt drifted past, but giving Myron a wary glance. David could have told her Myron was only dangerous to teenage boys looking to prove themselves, but he saved his breath. Ollie was right. They'd acted in blind fear, not malice, and now they were hollowed out. Whatever reckless fire had been in their eyes when they sent Norm out was gone. David told them they'd have to say something to the people in the market. Jim started to protest, but David cut him off. He and Ollie would leave out Jim and Myron's role if they backed up the story about what had taken Norm. Jim agreed eagerly, babbling about the danger of others going out like the woman who had already vanished into the mist. He wiped his mouth and drank more beer. Ollie voiced a new dread. What if the tentacles got inside? Jim dismissed it. They'd shut the loading door, but Ollie pointed out the entire front wall was plate glass. The realization hit David like a physical blow. He'd been ignoring that fact. He looked at Billy sleeping, imagined those tentacles swarming over his son, and felt his stomach drop. Myron whispered a prayer. David left them by the cooler and went looking for Norton. He found him in solemn conversation with Bud Brown at Register 2. The two of them, Norton's styled gray hair and distinguished looks paired with Brown's dour New England face, looked like a cartoon sketch. 24 people milled restlessly between the checkout lanes and the show window. Many pressed against the glass, peering into the mist like spectators at a construction site. Mrs. Carmody sat on a stationary conveyor belt, smoking through a filter, her eyes measuring David with cold assessment before dismissing him. David called to Norton, who asked where he'd been. Brown interjected grimly, noting people were drinking beer in the back. He could see them in the security mirror, and it had to stop. Norton excused himself and walked with David toward the beer cooler, past housewares and notions. David glanced back uneasily at the buckled wooden frames around the shattered window, remembering the pie-shaped chunk of glass that had fallen out during the tremor. He briefly considered stuffing the hole with cloth cheap ladies' tops from the wine aisle, but the thought dissolved into a surge of horrified laughter he had to stifle with his hand. He'd seen a small tentacle rupture. A bag of dog food cloth would be useless. Norton noticed his expression and asked if he was all right. David brushed it off, then asked about the bloody-nosed man who'd stumbled in claiming something in the mist had taken John Lee Froven. Norton explained. Brown had revived him with smelling salts and escorted him to the manager's office. The man had been calming down, especially when told the office had only one small reinforced window. David insisted the man's story wasn't a hallucination. Norton deflected with a vague agreement. Then David tried to steer him toward the truth about what he'd seen in the storage area. Norton, distracted, kept returning to Ollie Weeks drinking on duty. David forced his attention back, pointing to the double doors and explaining what he'd witnessed: the tentacles, the creature, Norm's death. He left out the argument that had preceded the disaster. Norton refused to believe it, dismissing it as a prank or mass hysteria. David brought him to Jim, Ollie, and Myron, who corroborated every detail, though Jim and Myron were already half drunk. Norton still balked, his denial hardening into defensive scorn. He accused them of playing a joke on him, calling it a belly-buster the locals had cooked up. His voice rose, drawing stares from the edgy crowd. He jabbed a finger at David, ranting about out-of-towners being treated like outsiders, resurrecting the bitterness of their property line dispute. His composure cracked. He was no longer arguing but nearly screaming on the edge of control. Ollie turned away, clutching his beer. Jim and Myron stared at Norton with frank disbelief. Norton's voice cracked with scorn, demanding to know if they expected him to inspect some cheap rubber prop while the locals snickered. Myron took offense at being called a hick, but Norton ignored him, fixing David with a savage grin and admitting he was glad the tree had smashed the boathouse. He tried to push past, but David grabbed his arm and slammed him against the beer cooler. The impact toppled 2 six-packs and drew a startled cry from a nearby woman. David leaned in, close enough to feel the cooler's dead chill radiating, and told Norton to listen. Lives were at stake, his sons among them, and he'd use force if necessary. Norton's bravado turned manic, his eyes bulging as he dared David to strike a man with a heart condition, old enough to be his father. Jim urged him on, dismissing Norton's condition and his character. David told Jim to back off, then pressed his face close to Norton's, accusing him of throwing up a smokescreen, insisting he knew the truth. Norton panted denials. David admitted he'd let it slide in other circumstances, acknowledged his own fear, but pleaded that he needed Norton's credibility. Norton screamed for release. David shook him, trying to make him understand that people would walk out into the mist if they weren't stopped. Norton refused to go to the storage area, still clinging to the idea it was all a trick. David grabbed him by the shoulder and neck, tearing the seam of his shirt, and dragged him toward the double doors. Norton's scream was wretched. A crowd of 15 or 18 gathered but kept their distance, offering no help. David hissed in his ear, mocking his own supposed prank, the fog machine from Hollywood, the shipping costs urging him to stop lying to himself. Norton bawled for help as they neared the doors. Brown pushed through the onlookers, demanding an explanation. Norton gasped that David was crazy. Ollie appeared, backing David up, saying he wished it weren't true, but it was. Brown's eyes fell on Ollie's beer, and he seized on it, predicting he'd lose his job. David told Brown to ease up, this wasn't normal. Brown smugly invoked company regulations. Norton slipped away, trying to compose himself. Then Ollie's voice boomed out, summoning everyone to hear something that concerned them all. He looked at David for approval. David nodded. The crowd swelled as people gathered. Ollie started to speak, but Brown ordered him to put down the beer. David told Brown to shut up and step toward him. Brown backed off, threatening to report them all and press charges. David could see Brown was just coping in his own way, like Norton, like Jim and Myron. He told Brown to take names if he wanted, but to stay quiet. Brown called him a bohemian. Ollie announced that David had something to tell them, especially if anyone was planning to leave. David recounted the story much as he'd told Norton. At first there was laughter, then unease. Norton declared it a lie. Brown agreed, calling it lunacy and asking where the tentacles came from. David admitted he didn't know, but that didn't matter. They were here. Brown joked that they'd come from beer cans, drawing nervous laughter, which Mrs. Carmody silenced with a cry of, "Death!" She strode to the center of the circle, her yellow pantsuit blazing, her purse swinging, her eyes sharp as a magpie's. She accused them of hearing without believing, challenged anyone to go outside and see for themselves, then fixed on David, demanding what he proposed to do. Her grin was skull-like as she proclaimed the end of everything, the last times, the earth spewing abominations. A teenage girl begged someone to shut her up. Mrs. Carmody turned on her with a threat about foul creatures. Ollie took her arm, telling her that was enough. She shook him off, still screaming death. A man dismissed it as nonsense, but Myron and Jim confirmed they'd seen it. Ollie added his own corroboration. Mrs. Carmody stood grinning, clutching her purse, and people muttered uneasily, glancing at the plate glass. Norton repeated his charge of lies. Brown said it was beyond belief. David invited him to come to the storage area and see for himself. Ollie urged Brown to go. Brown agreed, calling it foolishness. They pushed through the double doors into darkness. A low, unpleasant whispering sound came from the loading door, almost caressing. Brown's hand clamped David's arm, his breath caught. David swept his foot until he found a flashlight, bent, and turned it on. Brown's face was taut. Though he'd only heard the noise, David had seen the tentacles and could imagine them writhing over the corrugated steel like living vines. He asked Brown if it was still beyond belief. Brown licked his lips, staring at the scattered boxes. David led him to the shriveled tentacle fragment by the push broom. Brown bent to look. David warned him not to touch it. It might still be alive. He prodded it with the broom's bristles. After a few pokes, it unclenched slowly, revealing 2 whole suckers and a partial third, then coiled again with muscular speed and lay still. Brown made a sickened sound. David asked if he'd seen enough. Brown said yes, and urged them to get out. They followed the flashlight's bobbing beam back through the double doors and emerged into the market. Every face turned toward them. The low murmur of conversation died. Norton's complexion had gone sallow and waxy. Mrs. Carmody's black eyes glittered. Ollie stood with a beer in hand, sweat still streaming down his face despite the growing chill. The 2 Camp Woodlands girls huddled together like nervous colts before a storm. David felt a chill of his own as he looked at the crowd, so many eyes, disembodied in the gloom. He could paint them, he thought, but no one would believe they were real. Bud Brown folded his hands primly and announced that they had a problem of considerable magnitude. The next 4 hours blurred into a dreamlike stretch of semi-hysterical debate. People chewed over the same grim facts from every angle, like a dog working a bone for marrow. Belief came slowly, the way it does at a contentious town meeting. Norton led a vocal minority of about 10 flat earthers, who rejected the story outright. He repeatedly pointed out there were only 4 witnesses, dismissed one of them as untrustworthy, and noted that half the witnesses were now thoroughly drunk, which was true. Jim and Myron had availed themselves of the beer cooler and wine rack, and were deeply, abysmally intoxicated. David didn't blame them. Given what they'd seen, and their role in it, they'd sober up soon enough. Ollie drank steadily through Brown's protests, which eventually faded to occasional baleful threats about the company. Ollie never got drunk. He sweated the beer out as fast as he drank it. Brown seemed not to grasp that Federal Foods Incorporated might no longer exist, that the Eastern Seaboard itself might be gone. As the argument grew more heated, Ollie finally spoke up, addressing Norton directly. He challenged him to walk out the front door, circle around to the back where they'd stacked returnable bottles that morning, and bring back a couple as proof And if he did, Ollie would personally eat his shirt. Norton blustered. But Ollie cut him off, his voice soft and even, insisting that Norton's denials were doing real damage. People needed to check on their families. Ollie's own sister and infant niece were in Naples, but if they listened to Norton and tried to leave, they'd end up like Norm. Ollie's haunted eyes convinced some of the waverers, though not Norton, whose sanity seemed to hinge on disbelief. He and his group, reduced by one or two, retreated to the prepared meats case. One of them kicked Billy as they passed, waking him. David went to his son, who clung to his neck and begged not to be put down. He found a shopping cart and settled Billy in the baby seat. The boy looked too big for it now, pale and woeful, dark hair falling across his forehead. It had been years since he'd ridden there. The realization hit David like a shock. With the flat earthers withdrawn, the argument found a new target: Mrs. Carmody, who stood alone in the gloom, witch-like in her yellow pants, bright blouse, clattering jewelry, and oversized purse. Her lined face was parchment, her hair yanked flat with combs, her mouth a tight knot. She proclaimed there was no defense against God's will, that she'd seen the signs that the blind would not see. Mike Hatlin, a selectman in yachting cap and sagging Bermudas, demanded to know what she was proposing. She told him to prepare to meet his God. Myron snarled drunkenly from the beer cooler. Dismissing her, a rumble of agreement followed. Mrs. Carmody insisted on having her say, her yellowed teeth bared, describing the monstrosity that dragged Norm away, the abominations in the mist, the eyeless freaks and pallid horrors. She dared anyone to go out and see for themselves. David told her to stop. She was frightening his boy. The man with the little girl echoed him. His daughter had hidden her face against him. Mrs. Carmody declared there was only one chance: a sacrifice. A blood sacrifice. The words hung in the air. She seemed on the verge of continuing when a neat man in red pants and a sports shirt struck her across the face. Blood appeared on her palm, but her eyes danced with mad glee. A woman called out that she'd had it coming. Mrs. Carmody prophesied that they would come with the night, creeping and crawling, and when they did, people would beg for her guidance. The man raised his hand again. She dared him to hit her. His hand dropped. She walked away alone. Billy began to cry, begging to go home to see his mother. David tried to comfort him, but the words felt hollow. The discussion shifted to more practical matters. The plate glass windows were the obvious weak point. Mike Hatlin asked about other entrances. Ollie and Brown ticked them off: 2 more loading doors. The main doors, the manager's reinforced window. Talking about fortifications made the danger more real, but oddly reassuring. Billy perked up enough to ask for a candy bar. David let him go, warning him to stay away from the windows. A man near Hatland and Miller from Lynn, Massachusetts, a newcomer with a place on Highland Lake, suggested stacking the 25-pound fertilizer and lawn food bags like sandbags, leaving loopholes to look through. People nodded eagerly. David held his tongue, though he remembered the tentacle squeezing the dog food bag. A larger one could crush those sacks just as easily, but saying so wouldn't help anyone's mood. The crowd began to scatter, voices rising in scattered plans and suggestions, until the small, banty man with the receding red hair, Miller, called them back. He wanted everyone together, to thrash things out properly before anyone acted. Reluctantly, the loose assembly of 50 or 60 souls drifted back to the corner of the store defined by the beer cooler and the storage doors near the meat case. Billy, with the unthinking agility of a child navigating a forest of adults, slipped through the press and reappeared holding up a Hershey bar. David took it, unwrapped it, and let the sweet, simple taste settle on his tongue. Miller pressed ahead, prefacing his question with a self-deprecating remark before asking the crucial one whether anyone had a firearm. A pause rippled through the group as they exchanged uncertain glances and shrugs. An old man with grizzled white hair, who introduced himself as Ambrose Cornell, spoke up to say he had a shotgun locked in his car trunk and offered to retrieve it. Weeks cut him off quickly, his tone firm but calm, advising against such a move for the time being, and the old man readily agreed, adding that he'd only felt obliged to make the offer. The moment passed, and Miller seemed about to concede the point when a striking sandy blonde woman in a cranberry sweatshirt interrupted them. She produced a medium-sized pistol from her purse, drawing a collective murmur of surprise from those watching a magician's reveal. Blushing deeply, she introduced herself as Amanda Dumfries and explained that the gun was her husband's idea, a precautionary measure he insisted she carry, loaded but unfired except for a single visit to a target range. When Miller asked if her husband was present, she explained he was in New York on business, as he often was. He took the pistol from her, fumbling with the cylinder before confirming it was unloaded, then asked who could shoot it well, admitting his own lack of skill. After a moment of hesitation, Ollie Weeks reluctantly spoke up, revealing himself as a target shooter who owned several pistols. Brown made a cutting remark, suggesting Weeks would be too drunk to see straight by dark. Weeks' reply was blunt and dismissive, telling Brown to mind his own business and just write down names. The manager, stunned, wisely chose not to press further. Miller, blinking at the sudden tension, handed the weapon to Weeks, who checked it with a professional's eye before pocketing it, the cartridge box tucked away in his breast pocket. He leaned back against the cooler, opened a fresh beer, and David found himself reassessing the quiet assistant manager, feeling he was seeing a completely unsuspected side to the man. Miller then asked if there was anything like a flamethrower in the store, causing Buddy Eagleton to blurt out a curse before going crimson. When pressed, Eagleton explained that the store had recently stocked a full case of small blowtorches, but had sent most of them back after selling only a few, a blunder that now seemed monumental. The group took stock of their meager resources, matches, salt, and a collection of mops and brooms. While most seemed heartened, David caught Weeks' eye and saw only a calm, crushing hopelessness there, a stark contrast to the false optimism around them. The idea of fending off those tentacles with mop handles was a dark joke that only the two of them understood. Miller turned to Hatland to organize the work party, then pulled Weeks and David aside for a private word. Hatland, cheerful and eager, clapped Miller on the shoulder, remarking that someone had needed to take charge and that Miller had done a fine job. Miller joked about a tax break for his trouble, which got a laugh from Hatland before he walked away. Miller then glanced at David's son, and David assured him he was fine, but Miller confessed his own profound worry. Weeks agreed, discarding an empty can and opening a fresh one. Miller cut to the point, saying he'd seen the meaningful look the two of them had just exchanged. He then laid out his idea. A few people should wrap mop handles in cloth, securing them with twine, and prepare cans of charcoal lighter fluid by cutting the tops off. With those, they could make torches quickly. David nodded. It was a decent plan, not nearly enough to stop what he'd seen tear Norm away, but a step above flinging salt. Weeks added that it would at least give whatever was out there something to think about. Miller, studying their faces, pressed his lips together and asked flatly if it was really that bad. Weeks just agreed it was and took another drink. By late that afternoon, the fortifications were in place. The big windows were blocked by stacked bags of fertilizer and lawn food, with only narrow observation slits left open. A sentry was posted at each loophole, equipped with a tin of lighter fluid and a torch. At 4:30, David sat with Billy on a pile of bags at his post, peering out into the thick, swirling mist. It was heavy and dull, draining the spirit just to look at it. His son asked if he knew what was happening, and David confessed he didn't. Billy fell quiet, staring at his own hands before asking why no one had come to rescue them, not the state police, nor the FBI. David had no answer. Billy then asked if his mother was okay, and David, with a heavy heart, told him he didn't know. Billy, fighting back tears, said he wanted her desperately and apologized for his past misbehavior. David struggled to respond, his throat tight with emotion, and could only murmur reassurances as the boy pressed his face into his shoulder. He found himself recalling his wedding night, the simple dress Steph had worn, a bruise on her hip from a small accident, a realization that she was still her own person, and the quiet snow that fell outside their window. He held Billy, but his sobs continued, a kind of grief that only a mother could truly soothe. Inside the darkening market, flashlights, about 20 in all, were distributed. Norton, after a loud protest, secured 2 for his contingent. The beams cut through the aisles like restless ghosts. David continued to watch the mist, its milky, unchanging quality. Several times he thought he saw movement, but it was only his own jumpiness, and a few false alarms were raised. Billy spotted Mrs. Turman and ran to her. Eager for a familiar face, she gave him a flashlight, and he amused himself by tracing his name in light on the glass of the frozen food cases. She seemed just as pleased to see him, and when she came over, she asked if David's wife was with them. He explained she was at home, and she nodded, saying her own husband was as well. She asked how long he'd be on watch, and he told her until 6. Mrs. Turman asked if he'd seen anything, and he admitted he'd seen only the mist. She offered to watch Billy until his watch ended at 6, and the boy eagerly agreed, swinging the flashlight above his head and watching the light arc across the ceiling. She assured him that God would protect his mother and her own husband Alan, speaking with a calm confidence that didn't quite reach her eyes, then led Billy away by the hand. Around 5:30, the murmur of an argument swelled from the back of the store. A jeer was followed by someone he thought it was Buddy Eagleton shouting that anyone who went out would have to be crazy. Flashlight beams converged on the source of the dispute, the pooled light moving forward, punctuated by Mrs. Carmody's piercing, derisive laughter. Then, cutting through the babble, came Norton's courtroom voice, demanding that they be allowed to pass. The man on watch at the loophole next to him left to see what was happening, but David decided to stay put. The commotion was already heading his way. Mike Hatlin was pleading for them to talk things through, but Norton cut him off, his haggard, determined face emerging from the gloom, those 2 unruly tufts of hair still sticking up behind his ears. He was at the head of a greatly diminished procession, only 5 followers from his original group. He declared they were going out. Miller tried to block his path, urging him to abandon the idea and stay for the chicken McVeigh was planning to barbecue, but Norton shoved him aside. Miller's face hardened, and he told Norton to do as he pleased, but accused him of essentially murdering the people who followed him. Norton, with a chilling certainty, promised to send help back for them. One of his followers murmured assent, but another quietly slipped away, leaving him with just 4. Hatlin made one last plea, asking Norton to at least stay for a hot meal, but Norton saw it as a delaying tactic and dismissed him, accusing them of having already swayed half his people. Hatlin, exasperated, tried to make him understand the gravity of the situation, that this wasn't a courtroom or a game, and that there were real lethal things waiting outside. Norton scoffed, demanding to know where these supposed threats were, since no one on watch had seen a thing. A chorus of whispered no's rose in response, like dry leaves rustling in the dark. An elderly woman with bifocals asked if anyone would try to physically restrain them, and Hatlin admitted he didn't think anyone would. David whispered to Billy, sending him off on a quick errand. The boy looked startled but hurried away. Norton ran his hands through his hair, a theatrical gesture that made David think of a Broadway actor. He couldn't tell if Norton truly believed in his mission or not. He suspected that deep down, the man knew exactly what awaited him, and that the logic he'd lived by was now failing him. With nothing more to say, Norton led his followers, the elderly woman, a chubby young man, a young girl, and a man in a golf cap, through the checkout lane. As Norton's eyes met his, and started to look away, David called him back, despite Norton's refusal to discuss anything further. He explained it was only a favor, and took a package of clothesline from Billy, who had just returned at a run. He asked if Norton would tie one end around his waist before going out, so he could pay out the line and know they'd made it at least 300 feet. Norton refused, but the man in the golf cap volunteered without hesitation. David cut the wrapping with his knife, tied a loose knot around the man's waist, but he immediately retied it more securely. When David offered his knife, the man said he had his own and instructed him to just keep the line from binding. Norton, speaking too loudly, asked if they were ready, startling the chubby boy. David extended his hand, wishing him luck, but Norton studied it as if it were something foreign, then repeated his promise to send help back before pushing through the outdoor. The others followed, emerging into the milky fog. Their voices were strangely muffled. David could only catch fragments of sound. Hatlin held the door slightly ajar as David paid out the line. The 5 of them didn't so much disappear as seemed to fade, their clothes appearing to stand alone for a moment before they vanished entirely. He let out a quarter of the line, then half, and it went slack for a moment, then began to run out again, reminding him of a memory from his childhood watching Moby Dick with his father. 3/4 of the line was gone, and he could see the end lying near Billy's feet. Then it jerked violently, twanging off the edge of the outdoor. 20 feet of rope suddenly whipped through his hand, burning his palm, and from the mist came a high, wavering scream, its source impossible to identify. The rope whipsawed back and forth, skating across the open doorway, and then a terrible, ululating howl rose from the fog, drawing a moan of terror from his son. The howl was cut off abruptly, and for a long moment there was only silence. Then the elderly woman's voice rang out, a clear cry of terror, pleading for it to be removed, before it too was abruptly silenced. Almost all the remaining rope ran out through his fist, burning him more fiercely, and then it went completely slack. From the fog came a thick, loud grunt, a sound like nothing he'd ever heard, the sound of a huge and savage animal, followed by more low, tearing growls that eventually subsided into mutterings and then faded to nothing. Amanda Dumfries, her voice trembling, asked him to close the door, but he said he needed a minute, and began to haul the line back in. It came out of the mist, piling around his feet in snarled loops. About 3 feet from the end, the new white clothesline turned a deep barn red, and the final end was a chewed, frayed tangle of fiber and cotton puffs, each minutely dotted with blood. Mrs. Carmody shrieked that it was death to go out there, demanding to know if they could finally see the truth. No one contradicted her. Hatlin let the door swing shut. David reflected on Mr. McVeigh, the quiet, spare butcher in his spotless whites, who had been cutting meat in Bridgeon for as long as he could remember, though he'd never known the man's first name or his age. McVeigh had set up a gas grill beneath a small exhaust fan, and by 6:30 the smell of cooking chicken was drifting through the market. Bud Brown didn't object, perhaps out of shock, but more likely because he recognized the fresh meat was only spoiling. The aroma was appealing, but few people had an appetite. McVeigh continued cooking methodically, laying the pieces out on paper plates and lining them up on the meat counter. Hattie Turman brought plates for David and Billy, garnished with potato salad. David forced himself to eat, but Billy wouldn't touch his food. David urged him to eat, but Billy insisted he wasn't hungry, pushing the plate aside. When David tried to press the point, Hattie, sitting just behind the boy, quietly signaled him to stop. He relented, suggesting Billy at least get a peach, and the boy worried about Mr. Brown objecting. David told him to come back if anyone said anything. Billy shuffled off, and David felt a pang of sorrow watching him move. He seemed to have shrunk. McVeigh kept cooking, content in the simple act, apparently unconcerned that so few were eating. People coped in different ways. David had seen it already. He and Hattie sat together in the patent medicine aisle, surrounded by small groups scattered throughout the store. Only Mrs. Carmody sat alone. Even Myron and Jim were together, passed out by the beer cooler. 6 new men were on watch at the loopholes, Ollie among them, gnawing at chicken and drinking beer. The mop-handled torches and cans of lighter fluid were in place, but the confidence they'd inspired earlier had evaporated. After the grunting sounds from the mist and the blood-soaked clothesline, it was clear that if whatever was out there decided to come for them, they were helpless. Hattie asked how bad it would be that night, her voice steady but her eyes betraying deep fear. David admitted he didn't know. She offered to keep Billy with her as much as possible, confessing she was in mortal terror, though having the boy to care for would steady her. Her eyes glistened, and he patted her shoulder gently. She voiced her dread for her husband Alan, convinced in her heart that he was already dead. David tried to comfort her, saying she couldn't know that, but she pressed him, asking if he had any feeling about Stephanie. He lied, saying he didn't, his throat tight. A strangled sound escaped her, and she covered her mouth. He murmured that Billy was coming back, and the boy appeared, eating a peach. Hattie offered to show him how to make a little man from the pit and some thread, and Billy gave her a wan smile in return. At 8 o'clock the watch changed, and Ollie came over to sit with David. He asked where Billy was, and David explained he was with Hattie in the back, working through a series of crafts, peach pit men, shopping bag masks, apple dolls, and McVeigh was now teaching him pipe cleaner figures. Ollie took a long drink of beer and made a grim observation things were moving outside. David gave him a sharp look, and Ollie met it evenly, insisting he wasn't drunk, though he'd been trying to get there. He explained that he'd asked another man, Walter, who had seen the same phenomenon, parts of the mist darkening momentarily, some just smudges, others large as bruises, before fading back to gray. The fog was also swirling. Even Arnie Sims, nearly blind, had felt something was happening. David asked if the others had seen it, but Ollie said the other watchers were strangers to him, and he hadn't pressed them. David wondered if they were just imagining things, but Ollie was certain. He nodded toward Mrs. Carmody, who sat alone at the end of the aisle, her plate piled high with chicken bones, drinking what looked like blood or V8 juice. He added that she might be right about one thing, and they'd find out soon enough when darkness fell. They didn't have to wait until dark. As the evening deepened, with Billy safely in the back with Hattie, Ollie and David were still talking, when a man on watch up front suddenly screamed and staggered back from his post, arms pinwheeling. The mist outside had turned from pearl white to a dull slaty gray, and something had landed on the glass. The panicked watcher went tearing through the store, eyes wild, saliva glistening at the corner of his mouth, heading straight up the aisle. Cries erupted around them. Some ran forward to see, others retreated. David and Ollie moved toward the front, Ollie's hand on the gun in his pocket. Another watcher let out a cry of disgust. Slipping through a checkout lane, David finally saw what had caused the panic. He couldn't identify it, but he could see it clearly, something out of a Bosch painting, grotesque and almost comically hideous, like a cheap novelty toy. It was about 2 feet long, segmented, with a pinkish hue of healed scar tissue. Bulbous eyes on flexible stalks peered in opposite directions, and it clung to the glass with fat sucker pads. But protrusion at one end was either a stinger or a sexual organ, and oversized membranous wings like a fly's sprouted from its back. At the next loophole, 3 more of the creatures crawled across the glass, leaving slimy trails, their eye stalks joggling as they moved over each other. Tom Smalley at the next post muttered a sickened curse. The bugs were everywhere on the glass, like maggots on rotting meat, and David felt his stomach turn. Sobbing and screams filled the air, Mrs. Carmody's voice rising above the chaos, raving about abominations from the earth, while someone told her to shut up. Ollie drew the gun, and David grabbed his arm to stop him, but Ollie pulled free, insisting he knew what he was doing. He tapped the barrel against the window, his face expressionless with disgust. The creature's wings blurred as they flew away. Others followed his lead, tapping with mop handles, but the bugs returned quickly, wingless as houseflies. The near panic settled into nervous chatter, someone morbidly speculating about what would happen if one landed on you, a question David had no desire to answer. The tapping died down, and Ollie began to speak, but before he could get a word out, something snatched one of the pink creatures off the glass. David might have screamed. It was a flying thing. He couldn't be certain of anything else that materialized from a dark blotch in the fog, exactly as Ollie had described. It was white and leathery, with red eyes, and it slammed into the glass with a shuddering thud. Its beak opened, scooped up the pink creature, and it was gone in seconds, leaving only an image of the bug wriggling as it was swallowed. More thuds followed, one after another, and people began screaming again, stampeding toward the back. Then a sharper scream of pain cut through the noise, and Ollie said something about an old lady falling down and being trampled. He watched Ollie dart back through the checkout aisle and started to follow, but something caught his eye and rooted him in place. High to his right, one of the lawn food bags was sliding backward along the barricade, inching away from the window. Tom Smalley stood directly beneath it, peering obliviously through his loophole into the mist. Another pink bug landed on the glass at the post he and Ollie had just left, and one of the flying predators swooped down to snatch it away. The trampled old woman's screams continued, shrill and cracked. David's attention was fixed on that sliding bag. He shouted a warning to Smalley, trying to cut through the chaos, but the man didn't hear him. The bag teetered and fell, striking Smalley square on the head. He went down hard, his jaw cracking against the shelf below the window. Then David saw one of the albino flying creatures squirming through the jagged hole the falling bag had left in the glass. He could hear its soft scraping as it pushed through, its red eyes glittering in a triangular head cocked at an angle, a heavy hooked beak opening and closing with rapacious hunger. It looked like a pterodactyl from some prehistoric nightmare. He grabbed a torch and jammed it into a can of lighter fluid, spilling a pool of the liquid across the floor. The creature paused on top of the remaining bags, shifting from one taloned foot to the other, its wings striking the walls as it tried to spread them. It lost its balance and fell clumsily onto Smalley's back, its claws flexing and ripping his shirt open, blood welling up immediately. David was less than 3 feet away, his torch dripping fluid, adrenaline surging through him, and then the realization hit he had no matches. He'd used the last one an hour ago to light a cigar for McVeigh. The creature darted its head forward and tore a chunk of flesh from Smalley's neck. He was about to swing the torch as a club when the cloth-wrapped head burst into flame. Dan Miller was there, a Zippo with a Marine emblem in his hand, his face hard with horror and fury. He told David to kill it if he could. Ollie stood nearby with Amanda's gun drawn, but he had no clear shot. The creature spread its membranous wings and enfolded Smalley's upper body, and the sounds that followed were terrible, mortal tearing sounds. In a bare instant, David thrust the blazing torch into the creature. It struck with the insubstantial feel of a box kite, and then the whole thing was engulfed in flames. It screeched, its wings spreading, its head jerking as its red eyes rolled. He hoped, with agony. It took off with a sound like flapping bedsheets, tracing a zigzagging flaming course above the aisles, dropping charred bits of itself as it crashed into the display of spaghetti sauces, splattering red everywhere. It was little more than ash and bone, and the stench of its burning was sickening, undercut by the thin, acrid smell of the mist seeping through the broken glass. For a moment, there was utter silence, everyone united in the black wonder of that flaming death. Then someone howled, others screamed, and from the back, David could hear his son crying. Bud Brown grabbed him, eyes bulging, and pointed out that one of the bugs had gotten in through the hole, perched on a bag, its body pulsing, its fly wings buzzing like a cheap fan. David moved toward it, his torch guttering. But Mrs. Repler, the rope-thin third-grade teacher, beat him to it. She had a can of Raid in each hand like some improbable gunslinger, and let out a snarl of pure rage as she sprayed the creature. The insect killer coated it, sending it into twisting, agonized convulsions until it fell from the bags, bounced off Smalley's body, and landed on the floor, its wings buzzing madly before slowing and stopping. It was dead. People were crying, moaning, and laughing the laughter of the damned. Mrs. Repler stood over her kill, her chest heaving. Hatlin and Miller found a stockboy's dolly and heaved it atop the bags to block the hole. Amanda Dumfries came forward like a sleepwalker, swept the dead bug into a plastic bucket with a whisk broom still in its wrapping, and carried it to the outdoor, throwing it outside. It rolled on its side, and a pink bug buzzed out of the night to crawl over it. She burst into tears, and David put an arm around her shoulders. Later, at 1:30 in the morning, David sat in a semi-doze against the meat counter, Billy's head in his lap. The boy was sound asleep, and Amanda lay nearby, her head on a jacket. After the bird thing's death, he and Ollie had gathered moving pads from storage, and several people were now sleeping on them. They'd also brought out heavy crates of oranges and pears, swinging them atop the barricade. Each weighed about 90 pounds, and would be difficult for the bird creatures to shift. But the tentacled thing that had taken Norm was still out there, and the frayed, bloody clothesline was a grim reminder. The low, guttural roars had continued, sometimes distant, sometimes close enough to shake the building and make his heart feel like it was filled with ice water. Billy stirred and moaned in his sleep, and David soothed him, but his own brief sleep, barely 90 minutes, had been haunted by dreams. The night of the storm, Billy and Steffi standing before the picture window as the waterspout spun on the lake, and a giant red bird rising from it with a prehistoric wingspan that blotted out the sky. As it swooped toward his family, a sinister voice whispered the words Arrowhead Project over and over. Others were sleeping poorly too, screaming in their sleep, some continuing to scream after waking. Beer was disappearing fast, and Buddy Eagleton had restocked it once. Mike Hatland told him the Sominex was gone, completely wiped out, and guessed that some people had taken 6 or 8 bottles. There was still some Netol, but David declined. In the last aisle, a group of about 7 winos, including Lou Tattinger, had anesthetized themselves, and there were 6 or 7 people who had gone beyond that, lapsed into a complete stupor, staring with blank doorknob eyes. They had fallen through the cracks of a shattered reality, and might never come back. The rest of them had made their own mental compromises. Mrs. Repler, for one, insisted the whole thing was a dream, and spoke with conviction. His gaze drifted to Amanda. He felt an uncomfortable but not unwelcome pull toward her, a fierce attraction that lingered on the vivid green of her eyes, so startling he'd watched for signs of contact lenses, but the color was genuine, the wanting was sharp and direct. He desired her physically, even as his love for Steph remained absolute, a constant ache for her and Billy's return. He rationalized it as a product of the situation, but the desire persisted. He dozed fitfully, then jolted awake around 3. Amanda had curled into a fetal position, knees drawn up, hands clasped between her thighs, her sweatshirt riding up to reveal a strip of pale skin. Looking at it gave him an uncomfortable erection, and he forced his thoughts elsewhere to a fleeting memory of wanting to sketch Brent Norton the previous morning, to capture the man's sweaty, exhausted face. It would have been a good picture. It had taken him years to accept that being good could be enough. His mind drifted to the nature of talent, that curse of expectation that drove you to surpass giants, to measure yourself against your father's shadow. His own ambitions in fine art had faltered after a poor New York show. The critics had savaged him by comparing him to his father. He'd turned to commercial work to support Steph and their unborn child, convincing himself that serious art would only ever be a hobby. He'd done shampoo ads, illustrations for magazines, movie posters, work that paid the bills and kept their heads above water. A final show in Bridgeton had sold 6 of 9 canvases. The one he'd refused to sell depicted the federal market from the far end of the parking lot, with a line of oversized Campbell's soup cans marching toward the viewer, a piece titled Beans and False Perspective. A California executive had pursued it relentlessly, offering up to $4,000. But David had held firm, despite needing the money for a house addition and the 4-wheel drive. He'd kept it because it felt like his best work, a bulwark against the inevitable question, when would he do something serious? Then Ollie Weeks had seen it one day and asked to photograph it for an ad. Ollie's recognition had forced David to see it for what it was, a perfectly good piece of slick commercial art. No more, no less. He'd let Ollie use it, then sold it to the Californian for $2,500. The voice of disappointed expectation had fallen mostly silent since, leaving only a hollow feeling that its quieting felt a little like dying. Around 4, Billy stirred and woke, his eyes bleary and uncomprehending. He asked if they were still there, and David confirmed they were. The boy began to cry with a weak, helpless despair. Amanda woke at the sound and pulled him gently to her, murmuring reassurances that morning would make things better. Billy rejected the comfort, insisting nothing would improve, crying for his mother. Amanda soothed him, her eyes meeting David's over his head. The boy squirmed to face his father, stared at him for a long moment, then drifted back to sleep. David thanked her, and she said it didn't matter that he didn't know her. He replied that it didn't change what she'd done. She pressed him for his real thoughts, but he deferred until morning. She insisted on an answer now, but before he could speak, Ollie appeared out of the gloom, his flashlight muffled by a lady's blouse, casting strange shadows on his haggard face. He whispered David's name, asking him to come. Amanda agreed to stay with Billy, her voice betraying a grim certainty that this nightmare would never end. David followed Ollie toward the storage area. Ollie grabbed a beer as they passed the cooler. When David asked what was wrong, Ollie said he had to show him. They pushed through the double doors, which slid shut behind them, leaving them in the cold dark. David's unease spiked. The memory of Norm's death was fresh, and he knew there was still a scrap of dead tentacle somewhere on the floor. Ollie uncovered the flashlight and aimed it upward. At first, David thought someone had hung mannequins from the heating pipes, a macabre Halloween prank. Then he saw the feet dangling just above the cement floor, the kicked-over cartons below. The faces were not dummies. They were real, their heads cocked at unnatural angles, their tongues protruding. They wore uniforms. They were the young soldiers he'd noticed earlier, the ones from the Arrowhead Project. A scream clawed its way up his throat, but Ollie gripped his arm and stopped him, urging silence. No one else could know. David forced the sound back, choking out a recognition of the men. Ollie confirmed they were from the Arrowhead Project and thrust a beer into his hand. David drained it. Ollie explained that he'd come back looking for gas grill cartridges and found them. He'd pieced together what must have happened. They'd prepared nooses, stood on the cartons, tied each other's hands behind their backs, stepped through the loops, and simultaneously jerked their heads to tighten the ropes. They might have counted down together. David protested that it couldn't have been done, but their tied hands were undeniable. Ollie pressed that if the will was strong enough, it was possible. When David asked why, Ollie said he knew why not the tourists, but anyone local could make a decent guess. David pressed Ollie on the Arrowhead Project, and Ollie explained that he heard a lot standing by his register all day, rumors that had been circulating all spring, none of them good, all tied to that name. The memory of Bill Giusti leaning into his car window, reeking of alcohol and talking about different atoms, flashed through David's mind. He looked at the bodies again, the cocked heads, the dangling feet, the protruding tongues, and felt fresh horror at the realization that old doors of perception were opening the unguarded awareness of a child. Before tunnel vision sets in, terror widened perspective, breaking down rationality, overloading the brain's circuits, making hallucinations real. He saw the same recognition on Ollie's face. Ollie continued, listing names of locals who had passed along fragments of the story. In small towns, secrets leaked like springs bubbling up from the earth. You overheard something at the library, passed it on at the marina, and it spread. All spring and summer, he'd been hearing the same phrase, Arrowhead Project. David objected that the two soldiers were just kids, but Ollie countered that he'd seen young men in Vietnam commit atrocities. When David asked what could drive them to such an act, Ollie admitted he didn't know. Perhaps they knew something, or only suspected, and realized people in the market would eventually start questioning them. David pressed further, and Ollie speculated that the storm might have knocked something loose at the project. A possible accident involving lasers, masers, or fusion power. He even raised the possibility that they'd ripped a hole into another dimension. David dismissed the idea as nonsense, but Ollie gestured to the bodies and asked if they were nonsense too. The question now was what to do. Ollie proposed cutting the bodies down and hiding them under a pile of unwanted goods, dog food, dish detergent, to prevent the news from worsening the situation. David muttered about Nazi war criminals killing themselves after defeat, and Ollie agreed with the comparison. They fell silent as the soft shuffling sound of tentacles scraping against the steel loading door returned. David's flesh crawled. They agreed to act quickly. Ollie's sapphire ring glowing in the flashlight beam. David looked up at the clothesline nooses, sunk deep into the swollen necks, and understood why Ollie wanted to keep it secret. Ollie opened his heavy knife and asked who would cut them down. David swallowed, and said they'd each take one. They did it. When he returned, Amanda was gone, and Hattie Turman was with Billy, both asleep. He walked down an aisle, and Amanda's voice called him from the stairs to the manager's office, her eyes glinting. She asked what had happened, and he lied, saying it was nothing, a false alarm. She called him a liar, took his hand, and told him the office was empty and had a lock. Her eyes were lambent, a pulse beating in her throat. He hesitated, but she reminded him she'd seen the way he looked at her, and Hattie was with Billy. It was a way, perhaps the only way, to take the curse off what he and Ollie had done. They went up the narrow stairs, and he locked the door. In the darkness, she was only a shape. He reached out, pulled her close, and felt her trembling. They knelt, kissing, and he cupped her breast, feeling her heart pound through her sweatshirt. Thoughts of Steph flashed through his mind, warning Billy away from live wires, the bruise on her hip on their wedding night, the first time he'd seen her biking across the University Mall. His desire was overwhelming. They lay down, and she whispered for him to love her, to make her warm. When she climaxed, she dug her nails into his back and called him by another name. He didn't mind, it made them about even. When they came down, a creeping dawn had begun. The darkness outside the loopholes shifted to dull gray, then chrome, then to the bright, featureless white of a drive-in screen. Mike Hatlin was asleep in a folding chair. Dan Miller sat nearby, eating a powdered donut. He invited David to sit, offered a donut, and David refused, citing the sugar as unhealthy, which drew a laugh from Miller, who joked that he should have two. David took them, surprised to find laughter still inside him, and chased them with a cigarette. He said he should get back to Billy, and Miller nodded, observing that the pink bugs and birds were gone. The last one had hit the windows around 4. The wildlife, he noted, was more active in the dark. David remarked that Norton and Norm wouldn't want to hear that. Miller fell silent, then lit his own cigarette and stated flatly that they couldn't stay. David pointed out there was food and drink, but Miller dismissed that, asking what they'd do if one of the big beasties decided to break in instead of just bumping in the night. David knew he was right. The mist might be hiding them, but it might not for long, and a lethargy was spreading through him, an urge to play it safe, stay put, care for Billy, and wait for the mist to lift. He saw the same impulse on other faces. Some people in the Federal would probably never leave, paralyzed by the thought of going outside. Miller, watching him, calculated the numbers. About 80 had been trapped, minus the bag boy, Norton's party, and Smalley, leaving 73. Subtracting the soldiers made 71. Subtract those who had mentally opted out, 10 or 12 left, around 63. And of those, perhaps 20 would have to be dragged out. The conclusion was clear. They had to get out, and Miller planned to go at noon, taking as many as would come. He invited David and Billy to join him. David questioned the plan after what happened to Norton, but Miller insisted Norton had gone like a lamb, and he didn't have to do the same. With one gun, he hoped to cross the intersection to the Sportsman's Exchange for more weapons. David called it too many ifs and maybes, and Miller acknowledged it was an iffy situation, but he didn't have a little boy to watch out for. David told Miller to let it pass for now, and Miller, stretching, invited him to walk over to the window. They moved through a checkout lane and stood at a loophole. The watchman reported the bugs were gone, and Miller dismissed him for a coffee break, taking over the post. He asked David what he could see out there. David described the overturned litter barrel, its contents scattered across the hot top, and the first rank of cars fading into the whiteness. That was all. Miller pointed out a faint blue shape in the mist, his Chevy pickup, then reminded David how jammed the parking lot had been when they'd arrived. David recalled sliding into a close spot only because someone was pulling out. Miller pressed the point. Norton and his 4 flat earthers had gone out, almost the full length of the clothesline, and they'd heard those roaring noises. David admitted the sound was big, though he couldn't quite describe it. Miller then asked why they hadn't heard cars being bashed, metal screeching, or glass breaking. David had no answer. Miller proposed that the cars might simply be gone, fallen into the earth, vaporized, or something equally catastrophic, given the force that had splintered the store's beams and knocked things off shelves. The town whistle had stopped at the same time. David tried to picture a sudden drop in the parking lot, a precipice falling away into featureless white mist. He asked how far Miller thought he'd get in his pickup, and Miller admitted he wasn't thinking of his own truck. He was thinking of David's 4-wheel drive. Miller then shifted to the pharmacy next door. David remembered it had been open when they arrived, its doors chocked with rubber stops to let in air after the power outage. The pharmacy was only 20 feet away, yet no one from there had come over. Miller asked the obvious question: why hadn't any of those people turned up? It had been 18 hours, they must be hungry. David pointed out that pharmacies often sold food items, animal crackers, toaster pastries, candy. Miller wasn't convinced. He suggested they sent a small team, 4 or 5 people, to check out the drugstore as a trial balloon, a way to test the dangers outside. David asked if that was everything, and Miller said no, there was one more thing, Mrs. Carmody. He jerked his thumb toward the middle aisle, where she now sat with two women in bright summer clothes, their faces rapt as she talked and gestured with grim intensity. Miller warned that by nightfall she'd have more followers, and if the bugs and birds returned, she'd have a congregation by morning. Then they'd start worrying about who she'd tell them to sacrifice, possibly him, or David, or Hatlin, or even Billy. David called it idiocy, but a cold chill crawled up his back. Mrs. Carmody had power. Even Steph, usually hard-headed, invoked her name with unease. Miller described the people in the market as going through a Section 8 experience, their minds as twisted and buckled as the damaged beams. He'd spent half the night fearing he'd lost his mind, that he was in a straitjacket, raving about bugs and dinosaurs, and that it would only take a shot of Thorazine to end it. As people grew flakier, he argued, Mrs. Carmody would seem more and more appealing. He didn't want to be around when that happened. David watched her lips moving, her tongue dancing around snaggle teeth. She did look like a witch. What was she telling her two captured birds? Arrowhead Project? Black Spring? Abominations? Human sacrifice? He dismissed the thought as bullshit, but the unease lingered. Miller asked for his decision. David agreed to go as far as trying the drugstore himself, Miller, Ollie if he wanted, and one or two others. Then they'd talk again. Even that felt like walking over an impossible drop on a narrow beam. He wasn't going to help Billy by killing himself, but he wasn't going to help him by sitting still either. 20 feet to the drugstore. That wasn't so bad. Miller asked when, and David asked for an hour. Miller agreed. He made the rounds, first telling Hattie, then Amanda, and finally Billy. The boys seemed better that morning, having managed 2 donuts and a bowl of cereal, and David even got him laughing during a quick race up and down the aisles. But the improvement was fragile beneath the surface. Billy was still too pale, the skin under his eyes puffy from crying, his small face carrying a weary, almost aged expression. The adaptability of children was something David had always marveled at, but right now it scared him more than it reassured. After they'd caught their breath, they sat with Amanda and Hattie, drinking Gatorade, and David explained his plan to go to the drugstore. Billy's reaction was immediate and fierce. He didn't want his father to go. David tried to soften it with a promise of a comic book, but Billy refused to be bought off, his face darkening with genuine distress. When David explained they couldn't stay in the market forever, Billy's argument faltered into a weak hope about the fog lifting, which he didn't seem to believe himself. He just wanted his mother. That was the real cry beneath everything. Hattie cautioned David not to raise false hopes, and he snapped at her. The kid needed something to hold on to, didn't he? Billy's fear crystallized then, his voice dropping to a serious, frightened whisper. He knew the things were out there, waiting, just as they did in fairy tales, and he pleaded with David not to go. David gently pried the boy's arms from around him, insisting he would come back. But Billy's expression told him the child didn't believe a word of it. He walked away, and in that moment, David's gaze fell on a sight that hardened his resolve. Mrs. Carmody had attracted another follower, Myron LaFleur, a man whose haggard, bloodshot eyes and shaking hands spoke of a night of heavy drinking, whose careless decisions the previous day had helped cost a young man his life. He hugged Billy one last time and kissed him, then headed toward the front of the store, purposely avoiding the aisle where Mrs. Carmody held court. Amanda caught up with him, her skepticism showing plainly. She asked if he really had to do this, and when he said yes, she called it macho nonsense, her cheeks flushed with anger. He summarized his earlier conversation with Dan Miller for her, but the logic about what might have happened to the cars or the people in the pharmacy didn't sway her much. It was the threat of Mrs. Carmody that finally gave her pause, and when David scoffed at the idea of anyone seriously believing in human sacrifice, Amanda pointed out that history had its darker chapters. She made him promise to come back, to run if he had to, not for her sake, but for his son's, and he felt something in that exchange that unsettled him. While the rest of them were hollowed out by fear and exhaustion, Mrs. Carmody seemed energized, almost thriving. The group that gathered to leave was small, 7 of them, including Ollie, Miller, Hatlin, Jim, Buddy, and the implacable Mrs. Repler. Miller and Hatlin had made a half-hearted attempt to talk her out of joining, but she'd dismissed them with curt finality, carrying a canvas basket full of insecticide cans and a tennis racket that felt right in her hand. Jim got an uneasy reminder of his own school days when she recognized him and asked pointedly about his drinking the night before, which left him red-faced and stammering. By 9:30 they assembled by the door, each carrying whatever odd implement they'd found: a gun, a steel bar, a broom handle. Miller spoke to the small crowd that had gathered to watch, explaining they were checking the pharmacy and hoping to find supplies for the injured woman. He warned that at the first sign of danger they'd retreat immediately, but Mrs. Carmody, standing with her small flock, tried to whip the onlookers into a frenzy, shouting that they'd bring destruction down on everyone. The crowd murmured, uncertain, swayed by her predictions of doom. Then a can of peas flew across the room and struck her, sending her staggering back, and Amanda stepped forward, her voice sharp, ordering the old woman to be silent. Mrs. Carmody fired back with a vicious accusation about what Amanda had done the previous night, but the spell was broken, and the group pushed through the door. Stepping into the mist, David felt a visceral terror, his palms slick on the broom handle. The thin, acrid smell was everywhere, and the world dissolved around him within seconds. Miller and Ollie vanished first, then Hatlin faded from sight. He kept his focus on the red cinderblock wall to his left, and the ghostly shapes of cars to his right, telling himself it was only 20 feet. Then Miller's scream cut through the fog, raw and horrified, as he reached the pharmacy doors. Buddy Eagleton broke first, turning to flee, but Mrs. Repler stopped him with a light tap of her racket and a calm question about where he thought he was going. That quiet authority held, and they pressed forward. He risked one look back over his shoulder, but the market had been utterly erased. The red cinderblock wall thinned to a faint pink wash and then vanished completely, severing his last visible link to the world inside. A profound isolation washed through him, a feeling of having been violently expelled from the only safe harbor left. The pharmacy doorway presented a scene of raw butchery. A man lay face down in the threshold, his shirt stained a deep-dyed maroon, though patches of white at the hem revealed its original color. It took a sickening moment for the full horror to register. The man's head was simply gone, the space above his shoulders an impossible vacancy. Buddy retched loudly behind him, and Jim Grondin broke, turning away with his hands clapped over his mouth, his wild, bloodshot eyes meeting David's for one desperate instant before he stumbled back toward the market. Miller and Hatlin had already stepped inside. David's mind raced, trying to impose logic on the nightmare the creatures tracked by scent, not sight. The sealed market had protected them, while the pharmacy's doors, chalked open against the summer heat, had invited this devastation. He stepped forward, his throat dry and tight, remembering his promise to Billy. A Spider-Man comic and an Incredible Hulk lay near his feet, and he scooped them up without thinking, shoving them into his back pocket. Inside, the pharmacy was a crazy shambles of scattered merchandise and overturned racks, a brutal wreckage made worse by the strange, festive quality of the place. Thin white cables, almost indistinguishable from the mist outside, hung everywhere like streamers, suspending magazines and paperbacks in midair. A dark, bristly object on the floor drew Hatlin's curious prod, and in that instant, David understood with a cold, plummeting dread. He choked out a warning, the words scraping from his dry throat like something foreign. They were spiderwebs. They had to get out. But the mist outside was already alive with threat. A series of screams cut through the fog. Jim's voice, raw with fear, and then quickly escalating into pain. Then, an invisible cable lashed out, twisting around Buddy's thigh, and its corrosive touch began eating through his jeans and into his flesh. Ollie wrenched him free with a hard pull, but Buddy's lips had gone blue with shock, and the wound was catastrophic. Dan Miller, rushing back, blundered into a cluster of hanging threads and had to tear himself loose, leaving a flap of his shirt behind. The air filled with drifting, languorous strands, impossible to see against the white background, but audible as they flicked through the air. He dodged two by blind luck, hearing one hiss as it touched the pavement. Mrs. Repler calmly swung her tennis racket at another, but the corrosive web dissolved the strings in an instant, plucking them like violin strings until the racket itself was snatched from her hands and dragged into the fog. They scrambled to retreat. A strand whipped around Mike Hatland's left arm, then his neck winding with savage speed. His jugular burst in a violent fountain, and he was yanked into the whiteness, his head lolling, one loafer left behind on the pavement. Buddy slumped forward, his leg ruined, and Ollie confirmed the worst. The femoral artery was severed. The boy was already gone. Then a nightmare emerged from the mist, a spider the size of a large dog, black with yellow markings, its multiple legs propelling it forward with a terrible purposefulness. David felt his grip on reality waver, his mind threatening to tear loose, and he clung desperately to the image of his son to keep himself anchored. But Ollie Weeks stood like a rock, raising Amanda's pistol with the calm of a target shooter and emptying the cylinder into the creature. It shuddered and bled a thick black ichor, retreating with a low felt bass note of pain. They kept moving, struggling to carry Buddy's weight. Another spider emerged, wrapping itself around Dan Miller in a grotesque embrace, beginning to spin its lethal shroud. Mrs. Repler stepped forward and sprayed a cloud of insecticide directly into its jewel-like eye. The creature convulsed, mewling again, and lurched backward, dragging Dan's struggling, jittering form with it into the fog. David reached Mrs. Repler as she swayed, her face dead pale. He supported her as they made their final dash for the market door, the threads falling around them. One of the strands sank into her canvas basket, and she fought for it briefly before it was torn from her grasp and sent tumbling away into the whiteness. As Ollie leaned his shoulder against the inn door to hold it open, a smaller spider no bigger than a cocker spaniel raced out of the fog along the building's side. David hurled the steel bar like a javelin, impaling it. It writhed, its red eyes seeming to fix on him, before he turned and dove through the door, Ollie following close behind as it slammed shut. The pale, frightened faces that met them told the story before any words could. 7 had gone out, only 3 had returned. Ollie slumped against the heavy glass door, his barrel chest heaving, his white shirt soaked dark with sweat. He began mechanically reloading Amanda's pistol. A low, hoarse voice from the crowd asked what had happened, and Mrs. Repler answered grimly, "Spiders." That was all she offered before Billy broke free and hurled himself into David's arms, sobbing. David held him tight, feeling the small body trembling against his chest. Sleep came for him next, a dense, dreamless void that lasted 4 hours. He woke with a raging thirst and a pounding headache, his mouth dry as sand. Some of the milk had soured, but enough was still good, and he drank a full quart. Amanda appeared with old Ambrose Cornell, their faces drawn with concern. After he'd sent Billy away with Hattie, they got to the point Mrs. Carmody was gaining followers, and she'd started talking about human sacrifice again. Cornell was blunt about it. He intended to get out, one way or another, and he didn't want to wait around to see how far the old woman's influence would reach. Amanda confirmed that Bud Brown had already been shoved around when he tried to shut her up. David listened, his mind working through the implications. 8 people wasn't a huge number, but in a closed system with their numbers dwindling, it was enough to make her the most organized faction among them. His thoughts drifted back to a conversation with a writer friend about how people turned to the supernatural when machines and conventional systems failed. It made a grim kind of sense, trapped for 26 hours, their one expedition outside a catastrophic failure. People were desperate for something to believe in. Mrs. Carmody was a growth stock, as Cornell put it, and she wasn't going to stop. David found Ollie by the beer cooler, nursing a bush and watching the old woman's performance with an impassive, calculating gaze. She was tireless, her stream of hellfire imagery relentless, and her followers were swaying and murmuring, now caught in her spell. Ollie predicted she could have them talked around to actual violence by morning, and the question was who she'd single out for the honor. The list wasn't hard to guess: Brown, Amanda, the man who'd struck her, and David himself. He laid out his plan to Ollie quietly, drawing on the theory that the creatures in the mist tracked by scent. If they could get to his scout, pile in and seal the doors, they'd be invisible to whatever was out there. Ollie raised concerns: exhaust fumes, motion, and David admitted he couldn't be certain, but the alternative was waiting to see who Mrs. Carmody tapped for a blood sacrifice. Home was his first destination, he admitted, even if it was just to be sure about his wife. He made Ollie promise to take care of Billy if things went wrong, and Ollie agreed, suggesting a pre-dawn escape. They'd leave at 4 in the morning before the chaos could stop them. The afternoon crawled by in a slow, dragging haze. Darkness fell, turning the fog to dull chrome and then black. The pink bugs returned, followed by the swooping bird things, and in the distance, something massive roared. By the small hours, Mrs. Carmody's congregation had swelled by half a dozen, including Mr. McVeigh the butcher, who watched her with folded arms and blank eyes. She was wound tight, her sermon building toward an unseen climax, and her followers rocked and murmured with her, their eyes shiny and empty. The hours crawled toward their planned departure. David watched Ollie place a grocery bag under the checkout near the exit door around 3 in the morning. Then another half-hour later, moving with quiet purpose that only David seemed to notice, Billy, Amanda, and Hattie slept in a huddle by the cold-cut section, and David joined them, drifting into an uneasy, shallow doze. Ollie shook him awake at 4:15, Cornell standing behind him with bright, determined eyes behind his spectacles. A nervous cramp twisted through David's gut, and then released as he shook Amanda awake, her green eyes opening to meet his. He explained the plan to her, and then to Hattie, who woke with a pale, ravaged face, but an unshakable resolve. She would risk anything just to see the sun again. Her words struck something deep in David, a recognition of the mist's true power. Not the creatures, but the fog itself, the way it drained strength and will, the way it made the sun a distant silver coin in a dead sky. Hattie was right. That alone was worth any risk. Amanda agreed, and David gently woke Billy, then gathered Mrs. Repler with a brief affirmation. They assembled by the meat counter, 7 of them. Bud Brown declined the invitation with a surprising gentleness, saying he wouldn't leave his post, though he didn't blame Ollie for going. The sweetish smell of spoiling meat drifted up from the cases, a reminder of the decay setting in around them. But the air was also thick with Mrs. Carmody's voice, rising in a fever pitch of biblical prophecy. She was building towards something, her congregation swaying and murmuring with her. The word expiation ricocheted through the market, and when she demanded to know the only cleanser for sin, Mr. McVeigh answered with a single, chilling word: blood. The congregation whispered it back, a dark echo that sent a shudder through David's entire body. Billy clutched his hand, frightened, and David knew they had to move now. Ollie led them down the second aisle, his plan clear. He'd go first, open the scouts' doors, and they'd pile in before anyone could stop them. But as they reached the checkout, Mrs. Carmody stood waiting, her yellow pantsuit blazing in the gloom, her frizzed hair wild, her eyes burning. A crowd of followers blocked the doors behind her, faces blank with the dazed look of people who had witnessed something beyond their ability to process. Ollie asked her calmly to step aside, and she refused, insisting that going out was death. David spoke up, pointing out that no one had interfered with her, that they only wanted the same freedom. But she knew about the hidden bags she'd known all along, and she tore them open, spilling cans and shattering bottles across the floor. She screamed that they were sinners who had brought this upon everyone, and that sacrifice was the only answer. Then she pointed at Billy, shouting for the crowd to grab him, to take him. They surged forward, Myron LaFleur leading with a blank, joyous expression, Mr. McVeigh following with a face as empty as stone. Amanda stumbled backward, clutching Billy, her eyes wide with terror. Mrs. Carmody was a frenzy of yellow and dark joy, jumping and shrieking, demanding they take the boy, take the whore, take them all. A sharp report cut through the chaos. Everything stopped. Myron looked back uncertainly at McVeigh, then backed away and bolted, skidding and scrambling into the aisles. Ollie stood frozen in a target shooter's stance, Amanda's pistol clasped in both hands. Mrs. Carmody's hands were clasped over her stomach, blood pouring between her fingers and splashing her yellow slacks. Her mouth opened and closed, trying to form words, and finally she managed to prophesy they would all die out there. Then she pitched forward, her purse sliding off her arm and spilling its contents. A paper-wrapped tube rolled to David's foot, a half-used packet of Rolaids, and he threw it away, not wanting to touch anything that had been hers. The congregation was backing away, their focus shattered. Someone cried out in fear and anger that Ollie had murdered her, but no one pointed out what she had planned for Billy. The moment stretched, fragile and dangerous, and then Ollie spoke. "Let's go." Ollie remained fixed in his shooter's stance, but David could see the tremble at the corner of his mouth. He touched his friend's shoulder gently, urging him to move, thanking him. Ollie's voice came out hoarse and strained, the admission that he'd killed her hanging between them. David confirmed it, and thanked him again for that very reason. Then they moved. Without the grocery bags, David was free to carry Billy himself. At the door, Ollie paused to insist, his voice low and raw, that he wouldn't have shot her if there'd been any other way. David believed him, and they pushed out into the mist. Ollie moved fast, pistol in hand, reaching the scout before Billy and David were fully clear of the doorway. He opened the driver's door, then the back. But before David could react, something burst from the fog, a red clawed thing, the color of cooked lobster, making a low grunting sound like the one they'd heard after Norton's group had gone out. It struck Ollie before he could get off more than a single shot, and his body seemed to unhinge in a terrible burst of blood. The gun clattered to the pavement and discharged. David caught a nightmare glimpse of huge, lusterless black eyes and a long, segmented body dragging across the asphalt before the thing retreated with what was left of Ollie Weeks. For one frozen instant, David faced a choice: run back to the market or race for the scout. Then Amanda's scream cut through the fog, a rising, nearly ultrasonic sound. A spider had Hattie Turman, knocking her down and crouching over her, its bristly legs caressing her shoulders as it began to spin its deadly web. David yelled for Amanda, but she was gone, lost to shock. Cornell was backing toward the market, his eyes wide, before he turned and ran inside. Mrs. Repler stepped forward and slapped Amanda, once forehand and once backhand, snapping her out of the scream. David spun her toward the scout, shouting at her to go. She moved. Mrs. Repler followed, pushing Amanda into the back seat and slamming the door. David yanked Billy free and threw him in, then climbed in himself, a spider thread burning his ankle as he broke free and slipped behind the wheel. Amanda was screaming, begging him to shut the door, and as he slammed it, a spider thumped against the glass, its red, stupid eyes inches from his face. Mrs. Repler told Amanda to be quiet, and the creature gave up, unable to smell them through the sealed metal. It strutted back into the fog and vanished. David opened the door long enough to retrieve Ollie's gun from the pavement, half leaning out as something rushed toward him that he never saw clearly. He pulled back in and slammed the door, checking the cylinder. Ollie had reloaded it after the drugstore expedition. There were only a few rounds left, but David tucked it into the glove compartment and asked Billy if he wanted to go home. The boy said quietly that they'd try. Then David found his keys and started the engine, the confident roar drawing fresh tears from Amanda. He sat, letting it idle, waiting to see what the sound or exhaust might attract. 5 endless minutes passed. Nothing came. Mrs. Repler asked if they were going to sit or go, and he backed out, driving past the Federal Market as close as he could get. Through the loopholes, pale faces stared out at them, a final haunting image, and then the mist closed behind them. The drive down Kansas Road was agonizingly slow, visibility cut to 7 or 10 feet. The earth had been violently twisted, the road cracked and caved in places, and he used the 4-wheel drive to get over the worst of it. 40 minutes later, he reached the sign for their private road. Billy was asleep. Amanda asked nervously if he was really going down there, and he said he'd try, but it was impossible. Fallen trees blocked the way, and a hoary old pine lay across the road like a barricade, still a quarter-mile from the house. He parked, put his hands over his eyes and tried to think. Later, riding in the Howard Johnsons, David reflected on the futility. He couldn't get through, couldn't leave her, couldn't pretend the monsters were only back at the market. He could hear them crashing through the woods. He tried to convince himself that if Stephanie had been quick enough, if she'd gotten inside and buttoned up, she'd have enough food for 10 days to 2 weeks. But the image that stayed with him was her last floppy sun hat and gardening gloves, walking toward the vegetable patch as the mist rolled across the lake behind her. He had to think of Billy now. That's what he told himself, over and over, like a schoolroom punishment. So he reversed carefully back to Kansas Road and then sat there and cried. Amanda touched his shoulder and said she was sorry, and he agreed so was he. He turned left onto Route 302, heading toward Portland. The road was damaged but passable. The bridges worried him, but the Naples Causeway held, and the way was clear, if slow. The mist held thick. Once he stopped, thinking trees were blocking the road, but they were tentacles that eventually withdrew. A great green dragonfly-like creature landed on the hood, hovered, and flew off. Billy woke 2 hours later and asked if they'd gotten his mother. David told him the trees had blocked the road, but they'd come back to see. He couldn't tell the boy anything more than that. He didn't cry. Instead, he dozed off again, and that worried David more than tears would have. The boy was sleeping too much, retreating into unconsciousness in a way that felt dangerous. David's own tension was building into a headache. The steady crawl through the fog at 5 or 10 miles an hour grinding on his nerves. The constant expectation that anything might emerge from the whiteness, a washout, a collapsed road, or something out of a monster movie. He found himself praying, asking God to spare Stephanie for his own sin of adultery, begging to get Billy to safety because the boy had already endured so much. By noon they reached North Windham. Most vehicles had pulled to the side when the mist came, and the roads were eerily empty. He tried the river road, but a bridge had collapsed into a noisy stream 4 miles down, forcing him to reverse nearly a mile before he could turn around. They took Route 302 to Portland after all. When they reached the turnpike, the toll booths stood as vacant-eyed skeletons of smashed glass, all of them empty. In one booth, a torn jacket with Maine Turnpike Authority patches lay soaked in tacky, drying blood. They hadn't seen a single living person since leaving the Federal. Mrs. Repler suggested he try the radio. He slapped his forehead in frustration. He'd forgotten the Scouts' AM/FM completely. She scolded him curtly, telling him not to do that he couldn't think of everything and would go mad if he tried. The radio yielded only a shriek of static across the AM band and a smooth, ominous silence on FM. Amanda asked if that meant everything was off the air, and he told her it was interference, the mist damping the signals. He said he was sure, though he wasn't at all. They went south, the mileposts counting down. The turnpike was slower, clogged with rear-end collisions where drivers hadn't given up. Several times he had to use the median strip. Around 1:20, Billy clutched his arm and pointed a shadow as tall as a cliff loomed out of the mist, coming straight at them. David slammed the brakes, throwing Amanda forward. Something passed over them. He could only say that much for certain. Some things, he thought, were too dark, were too vast for the human mind to fully register. It was six-legged, its skin slaty gray mottled with dark brown patches that reminded him absurdly of Mrs. Carmody's liver spots. Scores of the pink stalk-eyed bugs clung to its deeply wrinkled hide. One gray leg smashed down beside his window, and Mrs. Repler said later she couldn't see the underside of its body, only 2 cyclopean legs rising into the mist like living towers until they were lost to sight. For a moment, David had the impression of something so immense it made a blue whale look the size of a trout, something that defied imagination. Then it was gone, its passage sending seismic thuds through the earth, leaving tracks in the cement so deep he couldn't see the bottoms, each one nearly large enough to drop the Scout into. No one spoke for a long moment, their breathing the only sound. Billy asked if it was a dinosaur, like the bird that had gotten into the market. David told him no, he didn't think there'd ever been an animal that big, at least not on Earth. He thought again of the Arrowhead Project, wondering what insane thing they'd been doing up there. Amanda timidly asked if they could go on, and David drove forward, weaving between the terrible tracks, until they veered off the road. That was what happened, or nearly all. There was one final thing. But he knew better than to expect a neat conclusion, no escape into sunshine, no National Guard arrival, no awakening from a dream. His father had always sneered at such ambiguous endings, calling them cheap shots, but that was what he had to offer. They reached the Howard Johnsons near Exit 3 as dusk fell, driving becoming suicidal. Before that, they'd taken a chance on the Saco River Bridge, which looked badly twisted but turned out to be passable, a gamble they'd won. But tomorrow was another question. Now, at 1:45 on the morning of July 23rd, he sat writing by flashlight. Billy slept on a mattress in the lobby, Amanda and Mrs. Repler nearby. Outside, the pink bugs thumped against the glass, and every now and then a louder thud marked one of the bird things. The Scout had maybe 90 miles of gas left. He could siphon more from the Exxon on the service island, but that meant going outside. He had a destination in mind now, the last thing he'd found. In the manager's apartment, a large battery-operated multi-band radio with a flat antenna wire leading out through the window. He turned it on, tuned through the bands, and found only static. Then just as he was reaching to turn it off at the far end of the AM band, he thought he heard, or dreamed he heard, one single word. He listened for an hour, but got nothing more. If it had been real, it had come through some minute shift in the mist, an infinitesimal break that closed again immediately. One word. He needed sleep. If he could sleep without being haunted by the faces of Ollie Weeks, Mrs. Carmody, Norm the bad boy, and Steph's face half-shadowed by her sun hat. He would leave these pages on the restaurant counter, and perhaps someone would find them someday. One word. If he had really heard it. If only. He was going to bed now. But first, he would kiss his son and whisper 2 words in his ear against the dreams that might come. 2 words that sounded alike. One was Hartford, the other was hope. The end. As the mist drifts back into the unknown and the lights of the supermarket finally fade behind us, thank you for sharing this journey. One of the most fascinating things about the mist is how quickly it came into existence. Stephen King wrote the novella in an unusually short burst of creativity, inspired by a real storm that swept across Maine. Looking out at the aftermath, he imagined giant prehistoric creatures moving through the fog outside a local supermarket. What began as a simple visual image became one of the most enduring stories of cosmic horror in modern fiction. King has often described writing as a process of discovery rather than planning, and The Mist is a perfect example. He started with ordinary people trapped in an impossible situation and allowed their choices, not the monsters, to shape the story. In many ways, the creatures are almost secondary. The real experiment was watching how fear changes human behavior when familiar rules disappear. That idea helped The Mist earn a unique place in horror history. Long before terms like survival horror became common in popular culture, the novella explored themes that would later appear in countless books, films, television series, and video games. Isolated survivors, collapsing social order, and the terrifying realization that human beings can become as dangerous as the threats outside. When Frank Darabont adapted the story in 2007, he had been trying to bring it to the screen for nearly 2 decades. In fact, he first secured the adaptation rights from King in the 1980s as part of King's famous Dollar Baby program, which allowed aspiring filmmakers to adapt certain stories for a symbolic $1 fee. Darabont's admiration for the material would eventually grow into one of the most respected Stephen King adaptations ever made. The production itself embraced an unusual approach. Frank Darabont wanted the film to feel less like a polished Hollywood horror movie and more like a war documentary. Cinematographer Roan Schmidt often used handheld camera work inspired by television news coverage and conflict reporting, creating the sense that events were unfolding in real time. Many viewers never realized that the creatures were deliberately shown sparingly. Budget limitations forced the visual effects teams at Cafe FX and Hydrox to be selective, but the restriction ultimately worked in the film's favor. By keeping much of the horror hidden within the fog, the imagination was allowed to do part of the work. There were also unexpected reunions behind the camera. Several cast members, including Thomas Jane, Jeffrey DeMunn, Laurie Holden, William Sadler, and others, had previously worked with Darabont on different projects. Their familiarity helped create the feeling of a community that genuinely knew one another before everything fell apart. Perhaps the most famous piece of behind-the-scenes history involves the ending. Darabont's conclusion shocked test audiences, divided horror fans, and sparked years of debate. Yet that bold creative choice became one of the reasons the film remains culturally relevant nearly 2 decades later. Few horror endings are discussed as passionately. The story's influence continues to spread beyond the page and screen. Writers, filmmakers, game designers, and television creators have drawn inspiration from its mixture of cosmic terror and social collapse. You can see traces of its DNA in countless modern survival stories, where the greatest danger isn't always the creature outside, but the fear growing within. If this retelling inspired you, the original novella remains one of the finest ways to experience King's vision. Its atmosphere, ambiguity, and relentless tension still feel remarkably fresh today. And if this story left you thinking, I'd love to hear your interpretation. Did the mist represent the unknown, human fear, fate itself? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you'd like to continue exploring unforgettable stories together, subscribing and sharing helps these journeys reach other curious listeners. Because long after the monsters disappear, and long after the fog lifts, the most powerful stories leave something behind. A question. And sometimes, that question stays with us far longer than any answer ever could.